to see you. How you doing?
Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for the 2024 Post-Election Conference. My name is Anna Sophia, and I'm the president of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. As a graduating senior this month studying political science and international studies, I could not be more grateful to the Dole Institute and Seib for pushing me to seek out opportunities in government and set myself up post-graduation. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@kau.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel, where you can also access videos of past programs. In addition, a loop hearing system is available if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of hearing devices. If you have questions about the loop or system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. We will have 2 sessions today. The first session will conclude at 3:45 p.m., and there will be a 15-minute break. After the end of the second session, we will answer a limited number of questions submitted by email, and you can also write your questions at the back table over here, where a student worker can record your questions that we can later answer. You may submit these questions by email at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Anna Sophia. Can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. Welcome to the Dole Institute. This is such an exciting afternoon for us. We're so glad you could gather with us for the 2024 national panel of our post-election conference. I see many of you in the audience are longtime fans of the Dole Institute, and so you probably remember that the very first post-election program that we held was in 2004, and that was hosted by, of course, my predecessor, Bill Lacy, who we're so pleased is with us for the last time as a moderator of this afternoon. So we've covered, I'm going to go through the numbers here. Presidential elections, general elections, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, virtually, and now here we are in 2024, and also in the intervening years with the midterm elections. This year, the 2024 cycle was set up to be somewhat of a rerun, but it ended up anything but predictable, and we're so honored that Bill is back here, well seasoned as he is, to lead us through this afternoon's conversations and the inflection points in this year's race. Equally exciting and something that we also look forward to, I know all of us here in the audience in the Dole Institute community, is welcoming back our friend and visiting fellow Jerry Seib, of course formerly of the Wall Street Journal and columnist of the Capital Journal that he wrote for over 30 years, to co-moderate the discussion this afternoon with our nationally recognized panelists this year. Thank you both to Bill and Jerry for building this outstanding slate and designing this discussion. I want to thank the team at the Dole Institute for all their work, the staff and students who put so much into producing our sessions this afternoon. And again, thank you all to you all in the audience for joining us. Reviewing a couple of details, as Anna Sophia said, we'll break at 3:45 for a 15-minute break and reconvene at 4 o'clock. She mentioned questions. We're doing that a little bit different due to the time constraint. You can email dolequestions@ku.edu during this first part of the session. And also, as she mentioned, you can go to the back table and write those out on paper. We'll get to what we can. We've got a lot of ground to cover in a very short amount of time. Lastly, thank you to all of you friends of the Dole Institute. I see many of you here. Thank you to our board members, our student advisory board members, and all of us folks as part of the Dole Institute community who support our vision a political discussion that connects across difference, that fosters mutual understanding, and offers a shared path forward. So it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Please join me in a warm round of appreciation for all of our national panelists, many of whom traveled a significant distance and are spending the time with us this afternoon. So let's give them a warm round of applause before we get started. Way to get that in.
He's in the spirit.
Very good. One more thing, if you're not on our digital email newsletter subscription, you can sign up on our website at doleinstitute.org. We have a fabulous slate coming up in the spring. You won't want to miss any of those announcements. And that's my final message. So with great pleasure, I will turn it over to Bill Lacy to make further introductions and get our conversation started this afternoon. Thank you so much, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Thanks for the reference to me being well-seasoned. I think that means I'm old.
Like a fine wine.
Okay, thank you. That was a very nice recovery. We have an extraordinary group of panelists with us today, and if you want to see their detailed bios, I understand there is a code on your programs. You can go to our website and look at their bios, but I'm going to do very brief introductions, and we'll start with my co-moderator, Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal, visiting fellow at the Dole Institute. Next, to his left, is Chuck Todd, who's the chief political analyst for NBC News and former host of Meet the Press. Francesca Chambers is next. Francesca is the White House correspondent for USA Today and is a former Dole Institute Student Advisory Board member. Brendan Buck, who joined us 2 years ago as a top Republican communications strategist who served 2 Republican speakers. Molly Murphy is a leading Democratic pollster and advisor to Vice President Harris's campaign. Alex Latchman worked for President Trump since 2016, including a 4-year stint in the White House political office and most recently as the Director of Congressional Engagement for the Trump campaign. Anita Dunn is a partner of the public affairs firm SKDK and a senior advisor to President Joe Biden. Molly Ball is the Wall Street Journal's senior political correspondent. And joining us for the second session will be Jonathan Martin, the Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico. So we'll get started, and Anita, I'll start with you, and this is not a particularly easy question, but it's one that we have to ask. The president was going to be a bridge to the next generation of Democratic leadership at one point. Was there any discussion about his not seeking re-election, particularly in light of his apparent age-related challenges?
Well, Bill, thank you for the softball. Appreciate it. I want to thank the Dole Institute for having us here today. I want to thank Bill and Jerry and Audrey, but I also just find this building and the exhibits here are extraordinary. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to come here. And I also just, Bill's small, gentle thing, but I'm no longer a partner at that firm. I had to leave it when I went into the White House. So anyway, so let's go back and level set here, which is an extraordinarily successful first 2 years of President Biden's term, historically successful, in which he and the narrowest of margins in Congress managed to pass historic infrastructure, historic investment in our chips industry and manufacturing reshoring back in this country. A Recovery Act that was instrumental in so many communities, not going bottom up, and also in us dealing with the COVID pandemic. Investments in clean energy manufacturing that created jobs throughout this country, primarily in states that are not Democratic, and also, for the first time historically, giving pharmaceutical companies, holding them accountable and letting the federal government, in particular Medicare, actually negotiate lower prices, which is not only going to be a boon to Medicare recipients, but also to that federal deficit that I think many of us are concerned about. So a historic, and that obviously there are a whole bunch of things that I know people in the White House are saying, she didn't mention the PACT Act. There are a bunch of things we got done. So then we have a midterm election. And the midterm election is one where it's a referendum very much on both the economy, and of course we'd had inflation coming out of COVID, and a country that was extremely unhappy about the economy for cause. Prices had gone up. We still had supply chain problems. Gas prices went up after the war in Ukraine began. So people were upset, and they had reason to be upset. But other issues in that midterm, the Supreme Court's decision, of course, to get rid of Roe v. Wade in June of 2022, and states immediately beginning to put some extraordinary restrictions on women's ability to make decisions about their own health, and also the democracy issue coming out of 2020, January 6th, and concerns around that. So you had three big issues. And, according to most prognosticators, and certainly according to history, that should have been a disastrous midterm for the Democratic Party. It should have been. I was there, by the way, when Barack Obama got, quote, shellacked in 2010. We lost 63 House seats, 63. I was around in 1994 when Bill Clinton's first midterm resulted in the Democrats losing the House for the first time in 40 years, and obviously significant numbers of Senate seats in both those elections as well. In 2022, the Democratic Party picked up a Senate seat, and only lost 9 House seats, which historically was a pretty extraordinary performance. The president came out of that midterm feeling as though he'd had a very, very successful 2 years, that to some extent that 2 years had been validated by voters across the country, and obviously we'd been successful gubernatorial races as well. And he felt very strongly that there were things he still wanted to do as president. So the decision to run, Bill, was very much, I think, one that both the politics and also the policy were dictating to him. Presidents and people who run for president make that decision because they think they're the best person for that job, And they can ask advice, and staff is going to give them their best unvarnished, honest assessment of what's going to happen in terms of the campaign. But presidents and presidential candidates make that decision because they think they are the best person to go lead this country. And that's what he did.
So let's pick up there because, Anita, there was the early fateful decision, obviously, to run, but there was another early and, in retrospect, fateful decision, which was to have an exceptionally early initial debate. Mm-hmm. Why the decision to do that? And I guess, Alex, from your point of view, why did the Trump campaign agree to a debate that early? Because it wasn't clear at the outset that the former president would agree to do that. But you first, Anita.
Great, and then I'll let Alex say that actually they were out there challenging us to debate all the time. So we wanted a debate, The president had done very well in 2020 in both the debates against Trump. We were in a situation where the race was still very much a referendum on the president as opposed to being portrayed as a choice. We were anxious to start having voters start to look at a choice again, to look at the two of them, as opposed to everything I don't like about Joe Biden, that they needed to be reminded there were certainly a lot of things they hadn't liked about Donald Trump either, and actually still didn't like. So we also were looking at a couple of other things that were very real. One of them was we needed moments to really galvanize our voters. We needed to build moments, particularly for our small donor fundraising. Debates were huge for that. We didn't want to do debates within the Commission on Presidential Debates. The Republican Party had already said they were not going to do it. Their schedule was very late. It was after people had already started voting, and was driven by a lot of considerations that actually didn't lead to the best debates. We thought 2020, that model, the two of them in a studio, had worked very well for the American people. And we thought that it made a lot of sense to try to do one before we went into the summer. They had a July convention, we had an August convention. We thought do one before the convention, one early September, around the time early vote begins, call it a day. So we also felt that voters, because of the president's age, would expect to see him debate, that was something they needed to see him do. And and former President Trump was challenging us to debate, so we thought, okay, let's do them.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our side, at the end of the day, President Trump drove that desire to debate. He wanted to show the contrast between President Biden himself, what he was going to deliver for the American people, the contrast in messaging on crime and the border, immigration, the economy. And so he was really the driving force. At the end of the day, it was the staff that was executing, and Chris and Susie leading the campaign, negotiating those dates.
Okay, after the president made his decision to withdraw, and I'd like everybody to feel free to jump in on this one because I'm not directing it at any particular person, but after the president made his decision not to run for re-election, would the Democrats have benefited from a contest for the nomination, or was that not feasible?
I don't think that the Democrats would have benefited from a contest at that late stage in the cycle. I think that already with 107 days and there being, sort of the other piece outside of just the calendar and how limited that window is Democratic-based voters were incredibly deflated. And what we needed to do was consolidate Democrats to get this race competitive again. I think that primaries in a long arc of a 2-year or longer election cycle can be very unifying. It can bring out spirited debate. It can identify important issues and priorities. It can stress test your candidates. But on such a narrow and concise window, I think it would have been a bloodbath that would have left a lot of Democratic voters feeling even more dispirited regardless of who emerged from it. Organizationally, in terms of the calendar, I think it also would have been really difficult then for whoever emerged to have the infrastructure. There are a lot of things that regular people don't take into consideration about use of funds and who is going to fund what programs, field operations, how best, that just takes time. It's not a sexy conversation. It's not an especially interesting one, but those also can add time and resource deficiencies, which was already an issue. If you remember at this time, right around this time, I think it was when Elon Musk said he was going to dump some enormous sum every day into the race. So resource consolidation was also an important part. So perhaps if the window was longer, there are all kinds of incredible what ifs about, what would have happened if there was a primary, but based on the time and when this happened and the state of sort of Democratic voters feeling disengaged, deflated in the money race, it would have been awful.
If I could just jump in here to kind of backtrack in time, though, this goes back to your original question, though, about President Biden deciding to run for re-election. He had said he was going to be a bridge and a transitional president, and the Democratic voters that I were talking to around that point in time felt frustrated that there hadn't been a primary, that if he wasn't going to run, that he hadn't dropped out sooner. And understandably, it wasn't until that debate where we all realized that he was not up to running for re-election. He himself came to that conclusion. But the Democratic voters that I spoke to in the lead up to the presidential election were begrudgingly supporting, in some cases, Vice President Kamala Harris. They wished that they had had an opportunity to take a look at the other potential candidates who could have been running, and to at least had the opportunity to have that conversation within the Democratic Party.
So, Francesca, I'm sorry, I have to jump in for a second. The president, in his statement, when he announced he was withdrawing, did not say that he had concluded that he was not up to it. He concluded that in order to give his party the best chance of beating Donald Trump, he was no longer the best candidate to do that because of the divisions within the party about his candidacy. But he didn't say he was not up to it. He basically said that given the divisions that had developed in the party around his candidacy, that he was stepping aside because he felt that the goal of beating Trump was more important. So I think it's important that we are accurate about that, because the president at no point thought that he wasn't up to that job or to the campaign, to be honest.
Well, he thought that he was no longer the best candidate to run against former President-elect Donald Trump in the election. But the voters, I'm saying the voters, felt that they wish that they had had the opportunity to vote in a primary situation. And there were a number of voters who I spoke to in the election who watched the debate and were disappointed, and they felt that he wasn't up to running the campaign in that election. I take your point about the reasons that he came to the conclusion himself. I'm more drawing attention to the fact that voters were frustrated.
But Molly, I was just going to say, Chuck and Molly, I'm curious, because there was a question about whether it was even practical at that point to have a nominating process at all. I mean, you've watched a lot of them. You've watched a lot of them.
That was the problem. It was impractical. It couldn't be done at that late a date. This isn't 1968.
Yeah.
Right? This isn't a case where you're going to be able to have the smoke-filled rooms and all of that
At
stuff.
the convention.
At the convention. And that's just not the world we live in.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting to me, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of micro decisions. And I can go through a whole list of what ifs. What if the Georgia runoffs don't go the way they do? Does Biden govern differently with a Republican Senate, right? That could have been, we could go there. I'll be frank, after going through the Hunter Biden trial and reading all those transcripts, I can't believe he ran the first time. So and I'm going to set that aside. I'm not here to troll or anything. I just, considering that he had 3 children in crisis, 2 children and one daughter-in-law, that was a lot to bring onto your family to make that decision. But I also think that there was a misinterpretation both of 22 and of 20. And part of it on 20 is, and I understand how it happened, 20 was a COVID election. And I think now it's easier to see this now than it was in the moment, which was any Democrat was going to win that election. I do believe that. We might debate this later, but I think we were at a point by the time of him, all the sort of chaotic nature of the White House, I think it wouldn't have mattered what Democrat got through that primary. And then there was this, because of the Georgia runoffs and January 6th, I think there was a mindset in the party and a mindset of this White House that they had a mandate that actually they didn't have, right? And whether it was going as big as they did, the whole FDR comparison business, and all of that. So I do think that we can sit here and live in a world of micro decisions, misinterpreting the midterms for what it was, misinterpreting what the voters were saying in 2020. I don't believe we have voted for a president since Barack Obama. I believe the country has been voting against. The country voted against Hillary Clinton becoming president in 2016. They voted against Donald Trump getting a second term, and they voted against the Biden-Harris administration in 2024. I think we are in a period of this. I think, frankly, it's very similar. I look at this and it's like we're repeating the late 19th century. In fact, if you look at the last, 6 of our last 7 elections have been decided by 5 points or less. In the entire 20th century, we had 5 elections decided by 5 points or less. And now, the last time we had a streak like this, last time we had 2 one-term presidents in a row, and we're now going to have 3 one-term presidents in a row, late 19th century. And if you want to know if history rhymes, go take a look at the late 19th century. We also had a very partisan media in the late 19th century. So there's a log, as much as there are micro decisions, I think if Harris had 30 more days, maybe she wins. Sort of in the same way that Trump won the first time, that she could have had the narrow slice. Another week in Philadelphia, another week in Detroit, another week in Milwaukee might have been the difference. And there was certainly a path. And I think tactically, the campaign deserves credit for, frankly, overperforming based on what we saw in the rest of the country that weren't battleground states. There's clearly, I think you have to give the campaign credit for doing what it did in 100 days. But I also wonder if we're going to end up talking tactically and sort of missing the bigger picture here, which is, frankly, and the Trump people may be doing the same thing, misinterpreting what the voters are saying.
Well, that's the story of American politics for the last 40 years, one could
Fair
argue.
enough.
Winning, overinterpreting, paying the price, and then rinse and repeat. But Alex, we're talking here about Biden world woes. You guys had a fair amount of woe to deal. I mean, your candidate was, after all, a convicted felon. He had lots of legal problems. They were ongoing. They weren't ended. When the campaign cruised into the primary season, did you worry those were showstoppers? Because the decision seemed to be made to plow ahead irregardless.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly had our fair shares of things that were outside of our control, some that were within our control. Of course, everything from the lawfare at the federal and state levels, dealing with those cases, taking a tremendous amount of time and resources to handle those issues. The assassination attempt, both of them, Project 2025 that we had to account for and answer for, that we had absolutely nothing to do with. The president didn't review it, didn't bless it. There were so many factors that as a campaign, you have to make decisions with limited amounts of information, certainly limited amounts of resources and time. And, the fact of the matter is we had a relentless candidate that who did plow ahead, did have the fortitude to say, I'm going to get this done. I'm going to proceed forward. I'm going to, sometimes the only way out is through. And so he continued to campaign and all the way through the end and just displayed incredible energy and again, fortitude throughout it all.
And Jerry, I want to jump in because I think that the Trump campaign doesn't get enough credit for having run a very smart campaign. Okay, and it was quite different from 2020 and 2016. I think a lot of us who were involved in one of those or both of those will tell you that it was that Susie and Chris, and obviously the candidate always, but that team ran a very smart campaign, a very strategic campaign, really going back to, changing rules in states so that, to increase their, the probability of him getting through these primaries, amassing the delegates, the kind of stuff they never did in 2016 or 2020. Their paid media campaign was far more strategic than it ever was in 2020 or 2016, their outside game. So I think this never gets discussed, but the Trump campaign, I agree the Harris campaign did a very good job, but the Trump campaign actually ran a very good campaign this time, and I think it should just be on the record, so.
But just one quick follow-up. But did you find, Alex, that primary voters didn't care about the legal problems, weren't really thinking about them, or actually were incentivized to support Donald Trump because of them?
I don't want to speak for every primary voter, but I do think that the indictments, particularly the Alvin Bragg case in New York, that energized voters, certainly, that caused that caused many Republican voters to rally around who had effectively been and continued to be the leader of the Republican Party. And so, yeah, I mean, that certainly helped with registering volunteers. It helped with our fundraising. So, that definitely was an inflection point during the primary race.
I would say, anecdotally, having covered the Republican primary, that certainly was the case. I mean, his polls really shot up after that first indictment and never went back down in the primary. And in part, it was because the other candidates who were allegedly running against him all rallied around him. And there's a chicken and egg question here, right? It may be the case that, Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and all the others felt that they had to agree with this line that he was the victim of a witch hunt and he was being targeted by a weaponized justice system. Because their voters already believed that. But be that as it may, because, in sort of normal politics, it's not usually a good thing when you're criminally indicted, in part because your opponents will make that an argument against your candidacy. But aside from Chris Christie and maybe Asia Hutchinson, none of the other Republican candidates did that. They all took his side, and so they're bolstering his argument that he is being targeted by the legal system, which ends up being reinforced with each successive indictment. And then I think the underrated, this has been discussed a lot as in terms of the primary, but the other underrated aspect of all this was the way that it helped Trump in the general election to neutralize the democracy argument. If you look at the exit polls, of the substantial proportion, I'm not recalling the exact numbers, but of the voters who said that they were concerned about the state of American democracy, felt that democracy was in danger, Trump narrowly won those voters because he used the indictments to make this argument that the legal system was weaponized against him. And so when, I think a lot of Democrats would look at the polls and say, look at all these people who are concerned about democracy, we're going to win. But a lot of Republicans were in that number, saying that they thought democracy was at stake for a totally different reason than Joe Biden did.
There's one other thing that Trump was brilliant about that was mocked at the time, and that was the decision to announce in late 2022, hurrying up and getting into the race, because it triggered something that ended up being a political gift. It triggered a special counsel, and it triggered special counsels actually on both Hunter Biden and Trump, right? I mean, this goes back to, wherever you are on this issue, if you think Trump deserved to be investigated on all of those things, you should be angry at Merrick Garland for dragging his feet for 2 years. He took a long time, so that by the time he was coming around to it, he was stuck having to do a special prosecutor because Trump announced his candidacy for president. And the minute he did, it triggered that. And it ended up being, I don't know whether it was strategic or not with Trump, right? He just goes through, but it turned into a strategic play because then you also had DeSantis who got caught off guard. There's, like I said, there's so many what ifs to do. But one of them in the Republican primary that I've always wondered, and I've had this discussion with a lot of my Republican sources, is what if DeSantis had gotten in January, right after he'd had the big win, gets in January. This person, well, I've had plenty of people say to me, 100 House Republicans would have endorsed DeSantis in January. Trump was toxic still in January of 23. There were a lot of Republicans ready to move on, right? But then he delays getting in for whatever reasons now, because he wanted to use his legislative session to set up what he thought was going to be his sort of policy agenda. So I understand how he was thinking if Donald Trump didn't exist. Right? If Ron DeSantis was going to be the front runner, the DeSantis plan of announcing in May made a lot of sense. That was the George W. Bush calendar that goes back in 1999. But that moment, I don't think we fully appreciate. And there's a lot of there's so many sort of butterfly effects here, right? Merrick Garland's decision to not do anything for a year on Trump contributed to this moment that gave Trump this sort of fighter. And by the way, there's a fine line between being a criminal and being a fighter. And Trump used it and became a fighter. And if a lot of the public thinks the system is corrupt, they're not. I've had plenty of Trump voters say to me, yeah, I know who he is. But you know what? He actually understands. They're all corrupt in there. And so give me somebody who's on my side.
So the Republicans running against Trump, of course, didn't make an issue out of the indictments and all the legal issues. But also, I'm curious, this is almost a question for Anita, the Biden campaign didn't really do it either. And of course, I understand they want to make sure that it does not look political, but it also feels a bit like something of a missed opportunity there. And maybe there's just the sense that you can't do anything to really, muddy up Donald Trump any more than he is muddied. Like, people sort of understand who he is. And I think one of the reasons why the criminal trial didn't do a lot of damage is because, he probably did that. Like, that's kind of how people look at it. They're not necessarily surprised.
He's not alone in doing that. They all do that.
Yeah. So, I wonder, just more from the Biden perspective, like, did you just not even really see that there was an opportunity there to do anything to him? Or is it just simply you wanted to make sure that, for the sort of not playing into his argument that it is somehow political?
Well, this is a president who in 2020, when he was running, it's a great question, because it was certainly a matter of some internal debate. But, he did pledge to restore rule of law, and he believes it, okay? And so there was a strong feeling that if the president or his campaign started attacking Donald Trump on these legal issues where our administration was actually going after him, that one, it was certainly like doing paid advertising for Trump at that point. It would have been his message. Look, Joe Biden's attacking me. His Justice Department is attacking me. They're investigating me. So that was one. But two, the president really did not believe that that was something that was appropriate for a president to do. That is going to feel very quaint in about 6 months, I can tell you, okay? But he felt very strongly that he'd been elected, kind of bring some normalcy, rule of law, kind of strictures back to this government, and that was not the place he was going to go. But I will say that from my perspective, it would have been a dumb thing for us to do politically. It would have been totally playing into Trump's hands.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I also was polling for the Biden campaign before the candidate switch. And we did some polling with the Wall Street Journal prior to this, but obviously these, legal woes and things didn't happen just when the charges were brought. And it was so baked in on Trump. People knew about these things. They knew these things were coming. The charges certainly, for some voters, may have legitimized them, but I think in our Wall Street Journal poll, when we were testing different attributes and traits about Donald Trump, 54% of Americans agreed that the term criminal described Donald Trump. So perpetuating and pushing this out was not necessarily additive. And we did some Republican primary oversampling in that about the impact of the charges. And there was an audience of people who said this has no impact in how I view him, meaning they already like him and this isn't going to make them like him less. And some people did feel more galvanized. And then for general election voters, they really felt like these things were so baked in on him that talking about it more wasn't necessarily bringing more to the conversation about the reasons that these voters may consider not voting for him. And it was much more important to stick to the pieces that impact the everyday person. And while it is very disconcerting that 54% of people would say that term describes someone who many will go on to vote for president, I think it does go to Chuck's point that I think there's going to be a surprising number of voters who believe that term criminal describes a lot of politicians, and that in some ways, certainly he's a higher watermark on this, but that cynicism does, it gives him a little bit of permission, and it ties up his opponents when it comes to these things.
There's so much about Donald Trump that is like that things happen that that just simply make people who love him more, and people who hate him more, but doesn't change anybody's mind.
By the way, I think it's funny that we're here at the Dole Institute.
Yeah.
Bob Dole, as frustrated as Democrats sound, talking about how does Donald Trump get away with this? I'm old enough to remember when Bob Dole wondered, how does Bill Clinton get away with this? I mean, it's almost like the same conversations, except it'd be like, voters seem to not like this, but they're okay when Clinton does it. And it is eerie. I've always said the two of them are sort of, you wouldn't have had Trump without Clinton. And discuss that all you want, but there's a yin and yang here.
Yeah.
If I can just raise one more counterfactual while we're in the land of hypotheticals before we move on from the primary. The thing that I wonder about is how it would have affected the Republican primary if Biden had decided not to run for re-election in 2022. Because the one way that Trump's opponents did use the criminal indictments was as part of an electability argument. You had Nikki Haley especially saying, look, I'm fine with the guy, but he has all this baggage, he can't win. And as Biden started to drop in the polls over the course of 2023, getting weaker and weaker and more unpopular, that really defanged that argument. And more Republican primary voters were looking at those head-to-heads saying, how can they say Trump can't win? He's beating Biden in the polls already.
Is that 2016 post-election or 2024? Same phenomenon. Late in the primaries in 2016, you had Ted Cruz saying, oh, Trump can't get elected. And the head-to-head showed, oh, yes, he can, because Hillary Clinton's going to be the Democratic nominee. Anybody can beat her.
But I was going to say at the same time, so I actually covered Nikki Haley in the Republican primary. So she was making other arguments, though, too, about the age of both of the candidates. She was drawing a strong contrast between herself and Donald Trump when it came to foreign policy and her stance on Russia's war against Ukraine. I mean, she certainly, was out there making other arguments that drew a contrast. And you talked about when Ron DeSantis got in the race, it wasn't just that he delayed that decision because of the legislative session until May. Recall that the moment where he actually started to lose a lot of steam was when he came out and he said that what was going on in Ukraine was a territorial dispute. That was really a clear moment and where he started to go down in the polling. So had he gotten in the race and made the same exact comment, I guess as Molly would say, in the land of counterfactuals, it's also possible at that point that he would have also started to tank anyway.
Yeah. I want to go back to Alex. Alex, can you tell us, was there any internal debate in the Trump campaign about passing on the primary debates? Whether or not it might backfire?
I don't know. to be honest with you. I know that that was something that Chris and Susie were talking with the president about. The president himself, I know, went back and forth on it. Again, considering
He loves a
counterfactuals.
microphone. It's shocking he didn't want to do it.
I know, right? So I genuinely do not know and can't speak exactly to that primary. I do know, at the end of the day, we were taking so much oxygen out of the room during the primary by not being there. Our absence essentially was felt more. And in so many different polls, right? We were polling 10, 15, 20 points ahead, depending on the early state. Why punch down at that level?
It should not have been a difficult decision for them to make. None of the other candidates were putting him in a position where he needed to.
That's true. They did give him a pass on it, essentially, didn't they?
Nobody got close enough to even sniff. I mean, he was never sweating for a moment. I think Ron DeSantis' candidacy tanked when he started campaigning and just proved that he wasn't very good at this. And I don't mean to be mean. He's not a very charismatic guy, and eventually, once you start campaigning long enough, that's going to become clear. If Donald Trump was in any real danger of losing a primary, he probably would have done a debate. But there was no real primary. Nobody was ever. I don't think that there's any evidence that any sort of counterfactual of how Republicans could have run this primary would have led to a different outcome. He was always going to be the nominee, almost no matter what.
But I do appreciate Chuck saying earlier, though, talking about the November launch, because that really, we received a tremendous amount of criticism for being the first out of the gate immediately after the midterms that didn't go as well as we had expected or had hoped. And meanwhile, you've got Ron DeSantis coming off.
Well, more than that, Trump was being blamed for the midterms not going as well as expected.
Yeah, exactly. And then you had Ron DeSantis coming in with a massive amount of money that he managed to transfer to a super PAC, and hiring up a ton of talent on the Republican side.
He was getting Elon Musk.
I mean, exactly. So I mean that to be in that position at that time was very, very difficult, particularly when you're talking about small states. Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. We did, pull some tricks to put ourselves in a better delegate position there.
Delicately.
But I mean, there was a moment in time, those really the first and second quarter of 2023, where, I won't say that we necessarily were afraid of losing, but we did have sky-high expectations vis-a-vis some of the other opponents and certainly DeSantis as well.
I feel like even though Ron DeSantis delayed his announcement to May and was unimpressive out of the gate, I do feel like Ron DeSantis showed that he did not have what it took to be on a path to the nomination, because Trump also, he announced in November because the announcement was, the date was set before the midterms. He was going to do this right after. I don't know that the date officially was set, but that was the thing.
I'm convinced it was connected to the investigations.
Oh, interesting. Oh, well, so it was presented as we've got this red wave coming and Donald Trump is strong and emboldened and he will ride that wave into an announcement. I mean, that was certainly, I'm not on that side of the aisle, but the way it was characterized. And then that didn't happen. And it was an unenergetic, sort of unceremonious candidate launch. It was not the energy that we're so used to seeing. And everybody was galvanized behind Ron DeSantis, and he had all this money, and he took no punches. Yeah. And he did absolutely nothing to capitalize on that moment. And if anybody has learned anything about Donald Trump, it is that he goes down sometimes, and he does not stay down long. And so if he wanted to wait and keep his hands clean, you do not have that killer instinct. You do not have the appetite or the will to go on to beat this guy in a primary. And I feel like when that happened, and nobody, I mean, and it should have been Ron DeSantis to take some real swings at a guy who was down and had very few friends out there because he was blamed for losing the midterms. That was his moment. Delaying his announcement, fine, but you can still be the lead attack dog within the party on Trump. And he completely blew it there, and there was no way he was going to be able to recover from that.
So Alex, let's fast forward to that moment when the president decides he's not going to run. Presumably, you had a path to victory in mind with Joe Biden as the candidate. What was the pathway then, and did it change when the opponent changed?
I mean, the fundamental issues of the race never changed after the switch to Kamala. I mean, it was always, and President Trump was relentlessly focused on the messages of immigration, the border, inflation, and the economy. And so we worked to transfer those failures over to Kamala by defining her as the borders are, by continuing to hammer away at basic pocketbook issues that, again, were not getting better. Obviously, you change your tactics to fit a particular candidate, and certainly some of the math to 270 changed when we looked at some of the states that maybe had been in play when Biden was the nominee or the candidate versus when Harris came in.
Like which ones, for example?
Like Minnesota, Virginia. Our polling looked incredibly bullish when Biden was still the nominee. When they made the switch, there was certainly, and Tony Fabrizio, our pollster, has talked about kind of a bump in an energy that occurred after Harris was the nominee. But obviously that continued to slide downwards over the next weeks and months as we started to really prosecute the case against her campaign.
Okay. Brendan, I'd like to direct a question to you. Early on, Democratic Senate and House candidates appeared to be outperforming President Biden in swing states. Did that indicate the presidential and congressional races were moving on to different tracks?
I certainly think it indicates that the Biden issue was unique to Biden and that it was an age thing and it wasn't necessarily much more than you could draw from that. I mean, at that stage, it's still early in a cycle, and you're incumbent. Thinking about the Senate races in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Ohio, you've got relatively popular incumbents who are going to typically be outperforming their challengers at that point. And those were probably always going to be closing. I can tell you though, Republicans at the campaign committees certainly weren't looking for a switch. They were very happy to have Joe Biden remain on the ballot, and not because they didn't think that they could do well with Harris, but they just kind of knew where this was headed. And at that moment, I think a lot of Republicans sort of underestimated Harris as a campaigner just based on 2019, and some of that I think did sort of come back up at times, but there was just a lot of uncertainty. Okay, we know that Joe Biden is not in a good path. We're happy to keep it there. Any change, even with a candidate we don't think is bad, or a candidate we don't think is a good candidate, is bad for us. And so they were all, I think, a little shaken by the switch as well. But ultimately, those races were always going to sort of close because it was still a little too early in the cycle.
Can I say, though, it ended up being the case that it was not a Joe Biden phenomenon, and that decoupling persisted, and we actually got a remarkable amount of ticket splitting in the final result when multiple Democratic Senate candidates were able to win in battleground states that Harris lost. And so I think what may have looked like a Biden phenomenon for obvious reasons was actually a Trump phenomenon. He's more popular than other Republicans, and his coattails didn't always transfer because he has an appeal, particularly when it comes to grassroots turnout, that Republican Senate candidates don't necessarily have. And I don't think it's just a function of popular incumbents, because Ruben Gallego was not an incumbent, Alyssa Slotkin was not an incumbent. There were multiple non-incumbent Democratic candidates that were able to win their Senate races very narrowly in states that Kamala Harris lost.
I'm not convinced they're ticket splitters. I think you have what I've been calling shotgun Trump voters. Mm-hmm. They come in, they vote Trump, and they leave. And you see the drop off, and you can see it, and you can see the numbers.
You mean literally? They
Literally,
don't vote
go
for
in.
Anybody else?
Correct.
Yeah.
They go in. It's interesting. There's some analysis that was just done by Vandil about news deserts and how they voted. Mm-hmm. But there is one of the potential connectors is that if you're in a news desert, you know about Trump, but you may not have even really knew a lot about the other candidates. And a lot of voters, I always say this about voters, they're always smarter than we treat them, meaning if they don't know something about a candidate, they don't want to risk voting for the wrong candidate. So they don't vote in that race. They'll skip that race. And if you look at the numbers, this appears to be more shotgun Trump voters than any sort of vacillating. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it does appear when you look at the numbers that this is more of a we saw the same thing with Obama. It's a reminder, these presidential coalitions accrue to the person, not the party. which is why they literally come apart as soon as the person leaves, right? Reagan's coalition lasted literally just enough to get George H.W. Bush elected, and that was it, right?
One time.
You know,
Yeah.
Barack Obama's coalition, basically, you know, their fumes got Biden elected, arguably, right? And then it's gone down. I think that this would be the warning sign for Republicans, that these are Trump voters. That doesn't mean they're Republican.
And the other just data point to throw in there, so Trump won by 1.5% roughly. At the House level, Republicans won by 3%. Now that's messy because, you know, who's voting in what elections and how districts are, you know, divided up. But it's just interesting that they're actually won by a higher margin at the House level.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one to dissect, because some of it is going to be a function of the way the lines are drawn and just, you know,
What's competitive.
And yeah, but then I think the other piece is, and I think this happened in 2022, and it happened this cycle at the top of the ticket level, which was campaign effect was real in behalf of Democrats, meaning so nationally there was a, you know, I guess in non-battleground states, there was a 6.7 point shift towards Trump from 2020. And in the campaign states where there was active program going on, field, you know, paid media, all of those things, it was 3 points. And I think that arguably you could make the case in some of these competitive House races that campaign effect held off some of the like larger Republican swing.
So Molly, you literally rode the transition from candidate Biden to candidate Harris. When that switch happened, and it's worth noting nothing like this has ever happened in modern political history, what steps did the campaign, call it the Biden or the Harris campaign, whichever you want, take in those early days to make this movement happen?
I mean, so I can comment on the specific pieces I was involved with. I can sort of give a cursory, there was a lot of operations on the legal end side, on calling delegates, on making sure that she was on a path to become the nominee to avoid a competitive primary and open process. Those are not conversations I was a part of, but knew was happening. You know, as the pollster, one of the pollsters, a lot of it was, okay, what we know about the vice president is that you know, she has very high name ID, but very little branding. And that is a opportunity and that is a challenge. And so digging in to figure out in a very short window of time, what are the things that voters need to learn about her to connect with her in the most positive way possible? Oftentimes those are not a list of policy priorities. They're not a list of, you know, sort of her agenda items as much as where did she come from? What has she done before being the vice president? And so we had to go to work very immediately. There was no prior research prior to the candidate switch of a backup plan, and we just, you know, pulled that out. And so we really were doing that in real time in terms of figuring out the ways to best introduce her to voters. Of course, the Trump campaign had a longer lead time. As they have said, they were prepared for a potential like this. They had more sort of ready to go. And so we also knew that they were going to be moving quickly. So the other piece of it was figuring out what are the leading vulnerabilities. Does she have vulnerabilities that are different than the president's, or is this all about inheriting the administration's vulnerabilities? And so what do we need to do to reassure and defend against those attacks? And then the last thing I would say, just from a pure targeting standpoint, is who are the voters we should be talking to? As we've talked about, there was a lack of consolidation among some of President Biden's 2020 supporters, disproportionately younger voters, people of color, people who historically vote for Democrats, were voting for Democrats in Senate or House races. Do they come back? Does their, you know, sort of reluctance extend to the president's vice president? And so figuring out who do we need to be talking to? Do they come back, and watching that happen? And so those were the things we did, you know, in week one.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit more about what those data points were? Like what vulnerabilities did she have in your research, and what unique strengths did she have in that early research?
Yeah, so she started with a strength of being more relatable. I mean, her youth and her energy was very connective to people. They felt like she inherently had a better understanding of what their lives were like, more so than Trump and Biden, just by virtue of being younger and being more connected to a lot of the people that we know we needed to reach. She came across as genuine. She came across as caring. She what our vulnerabilities were what has she done? Does she have experience? They obviously were going hard on she's done a lot and it's all bad. And we needed to figure out, okay, what are the things they need to know about what she's done? And one of the important parts was distancing her from Washington. I mean, one of her biggest vulnerabilities was the things that the administration had done that people weren't happy about, whether it was the border, whether it was just inflation and not doing enough, in their perceptions to address it. And so we did a lot in that early window of the prosecutorial background, what she did both in terms of security and safety, because we knew we were going to face border and crime-related attacks. So we wanted to inoculate on that, talk about what her record actually was, and then talking about the things she had done for regular people. So standing up to the banks, to keep people in their homes during the foreclosure crisis, those sorts of things. And I think that in the beginning, to be quite blunt, and I guess I haven't spoken about this before, there was a lot of, sort of right-wing media, even before the candidate switch, about word salads, rambling answers, not being concise, that was being sort of ginned up as, oh, she's not intelligent, she's not smart, and obviously there's some coded language there. That was more intense in the beginning, I would say, and as she did go front and center, I actually expected that to be more of a sort of secondary plot line from Republicans in the Trump campaign, that they were not just going to say she did these bad things, but also, doesn't have the stuff. And I think that's where she campaigned. And the best way to combat that with voters is to show them that that's not true, not to tell them that that's not true. But I think her strong debate performance, I think there were things she did that really took that off the table, but that was one of the early ones also.
So the shortened time frame absolutely hurt her, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to unpack that here. But I just want to go back to something you were talking about the defining her. It didn't just start happen in that 3-month time period. Going back to 2022, her team had already realized that she had a problem here, that people didn't know what she did as vice president, that what they did know about her, even among Democrats, they didn't necessarily like. There was this picture, as you were talking about, that had been painted of her, that she was either incompetent or that she had not done a good job on the border, even though the president had charged her with addressing the root causes of migration, which wasn't the same as being in charge of the southern border, but people were really confused about that. So there was a shakeup on her team in 2022. In which they came in and they really tried to rehabilitate her, address her image problems. They put her on national television and had her do some interviews around that time. They tried to get her more out of Washington, inside of the country, so that she could meet face-to-face with voters. By the time that she became the nominee, or rather Biden dropped out and she knew that she was going to be the likely nominee, they were also already preparing for a 2028 situation where she was going to run most likely at that time. So they had already, at least in the inner circle, begun keeping lists of people that she had met with. Like every person she'd been in a photo line with, that she had met with in her office, that she just met with out in events. And so while there was certainly work that had to be done to reach out to all these constituency groups and introduce her to the nation, there was some work that existed already and lists that they could turn on and activists who she had met with who they could call for support easily early on.
Anita, you wanted to jump in.
I did want to jump in because I think this is an important point. Brendan mentioned that when she got in, there was an expectation that she was the 2019 candidate. She was not. And I think she performed at a very high level. And those of us who had been working with her were not surprised because really, as Francesca said, starting in 2022, and particularly after the Dobbs decision came down, she was given the leadership within the administration to kind of be our point person on those issues, and she did a great job. And she traveled the country, she connected with voters, and anyone who was watching her should not have been surprised at how well she performed when she became the candidate, but most people were not watching her. So I think that she benefited some immediately by, some unreasonably low expectations around how she was going to perform, because she actually came in and performed extremely well, and I would say throughout the campaign.
But there was a difference too, though, once she became the candidate. As someone who covered for
absolutely.
for 5 years, I covered her in her 2019 campaign. I covered her vice presidency. Spent a lot of time watching her. When she came in, I mean, almost the moment that she was the one who was going to be on the ticket, from that first time that she addressed the staff, the campaign staff at the Delaware headquarters, there was this new sense of confidence from her that you heard when she was speaking on behalf of herself and no longer the number two and speaking on behalf of President Biden. And I think you see this with a lot of candidates and vice presidents and vice presidential candidates when you've been the number one and then you have to be the number two and you're not necessarily pushing your own agenda anymore, you're pushing someone else's agenda. And I think from the very beginning, part of the reason it wasn't an issue in the campaign longer is because from the very beginning she came out firm and confident, and then you guys were able to move on from that to other issues.
This is, though, why I question the idea that the shortened time frame was a liability, because Kamala Harris opened up a lead in the polls coming out of the convention, late August, early September, and it was steadily downhill from there. And so this idea that she would have done better if she'd had another 30 days, I think she would have done better if she had 30 fewer days. And it really speaks to the effectiveness of the Trump campaign in prosecuting the argument the way that they did, that the longer she was in there, because she did really defy a lot of people's low expectations when she got in the race, and she did open up a lead in the polls, and the Trump campaign was very nervous at that stage, and they kept hammering away at her, and she did go steadily downward as the weeks went on.
Molly, I'd like to go back to you and ask you to take a few minutes to describe the vice president's pathway to victory as you saw it inside the campaign.
Sure. So Alex is right. I think that, the map was getting fluid in that period after the debate with the president on the ticket. And so I think what we saw immediately is that the core 7 battleground states were very much the battleground states. There was no risk in our minds that the Trump campaign was going to be able to expand the map, goad us into going somewhere else and playing defense. So that was absolutely always the sort of state of play in that path to 270, with a particular sort of priority behind the blue wall. Those were always the most competitive states, on election day and I guess in the final margins. That also proved to be true, that those races, those 3 states in particular, always looked to be the best path, though the Sun Belt never really fully, sort of separated in a way that favored Trump so handily that you could sort of take it off of your map. And I would say that was particularly true of Georgia. Demographically speaking, obviously those states all have different, sort of composites of the electorate. Nevada and Arizona, heavy Latino population. North Carolina, Georgia, heavier African-American population, working class voters in, the sort of blue wall. But generally speaking, what we saw was that while we saw a lot of snapback from the, sort of voters that weren't supporting the president, that had supported him in 20, younger voters, people of color, they were still not performing at 2020 levels. And the bigger piece of this is there are a lot of voters that show up in presidential elections who did not vote in the last presidential election. Those voters were woefully supportive of Donald Trump against the president. It became more muddied who those new voters were going to be in this electorate. Were they going to be the rural working class voters that typically comprised, new voter electorates coming in for Trump, those shotgun Trump voters? Or were they going to be more energized by the vice president and a sense of relief that this was not just going to be a rematch? And so we looked at the voters in sort of different categories, just in terms of trying to understand them a little bit more. Targeting the younger voters, especially younger men, across racial lines was a huge priority. But we also felt like we saw what Trump was doing to specifically reach out to them, and we wanted to expand our gender gap with women. We saw that after Dobbs as an opportunity, and we had seen a growing gender gap in even prior to Dobbs, election in favor of Democrats. So could we expand that while also sort of holding the line with younger men? We spent a lot of time targeting younger voters. We also wanted to make sure that the president's unique strength with seniors didn't exist only with him. That was a group that he did very well with in 20. That was a group that had very little erosion even in the rematch in 2024. And so looking at seniors, and she actually performed consistent with seniors as they performed in 2020. But so map-wise, it was those 7 states with particular emphasis on the blue wall, but then it really was those younger voters, the more disaffected ones, less so those that identified as Democrats. I mean, it was the ones who are more cynical, certainly don't identify with either party, aren't necessarily angry Democrats who are withholding support, but instead are much more sort of persuadable, anti-establishment, cynical about government, cynical about how the last few years of their lives had.
Were these all Kennedy voters for a while?
Not, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
were they sitting in Kennedy before the switch?
before the switch, yes. And that was one thing that, when we say that this race got competitive, it was not that a bunch of Trump voters migrated to supporting the vice president. We went in every state from double digits, sometimes approaching teens, vote share, voting for collectively third party, but disproportionately Kennedy. He had his moment far earlier in the campaign, and it was more fractured. I mean, I think in early 2024, Kennedy himself was at 10-12% in polls. By this point in the summer, it was far lower.
He was none of the above for a lot of these voters.
It was a smattering. It was I'm just not happy.
Right.
And so a lot of that came back, and I think within the span, and I think this is true of the Trump polling because I've talked to their pollster, it went from, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12% of voters voting for some third-party candidate to 3%. And it became a razor-thin race that remained. I sort of dispute that the race went downhill for her from her early entry point. It really was, she had a bit of a bump, and then it was a dead-even race, pretty much, and unchangeably so, with a very small number of undecided voters.
Alex, I have a question too. So some of the other senior staff from the Harris campaign have said recently that they never saw her up in the polling, that she never had any lead in the polling. In y'all's internal polling, did you guys ever see Vice President Harris with a lead?
We saw some numbers that were margin, particularly in the blue wall states, and so that certainly concerned us. Nebraska too was obviously never in play in our polling, but upper blue wall states, there was a concern. I mean, ironically, for as dynamic as this campaign has been and it was. It ended up really where we started and where we had planned all along in terms of our field program, our mechanics as a campaign, really the 7 core battleground states. And we're talking 1, 2, 3 points maximum in some of these states in fighting for every vote in every different demographic. And so that was interesting to see again, as the map expanded with Biden at the top of the ticket, and then it became, it kind of settled into, again, just quite frankly, a margin race.
So you're talking about the enduring stability of the electorate, really, here, Alex. And let me raise one question that may bear on that point. On July 13th, something very dramatic happened.
Yeah.
There was an assassination attempt, and the former president, was actually wounded in that. It is hard to imagine a more dramatic event in a campaign cycle than that. And there was certainly an expectation it would change something. But I think as we sit here today, it doesn't seem to have had much impact at all. But maybe I'm wrong. And I'm curious for anybody to answer this, but maybe starting with you, Alex. Did it matter? And then Anita. Well, it mattered, obviously, but did it change anything?
Sure. I mean, I think it solidified an image very, very concretely of Donald Trump as a fighter and as the candidate who will fight for you.
Yeah.
You can't script that moment, obviously. It hits very close to home for a lot of us. I mean, you certainly can understand.
Yeah.
And so I think that, at the end of the day, it did harden people and it hardened some of our existing supporters, and they understood in a very tangible way how important this race was.
So this is the first campaign in a long time when there's been relatively little coverage of the paid media in the battleground states. I'll tell you, I left the White House and I was working with Future Forward, which was the primary Democratic super PAC. In our research, as the closing days of the race with a dwindling number of undecided voters, this was something people really came back to as kind of a symbol of strength, but also a symbol of somebody who was a fighter and somebody who was going to stand up. But more importantly, and again, if you look at the images the Trump campaign and their super PACs were using in their advertising during their kind of final closing argument ads, and the last 10 days of the campaign, that image everywhere. It was a powerful image. It was a powerful image for voters. And I think because this happened during the month of hell for the Democratic Party, that people didn't pay as much attention to it, but voters paid attention to it. I also think that, along with the legal things, and Molly talked earlier about how that undercut the democracy argument, I also think this undercut the democracy argument for Democrats a little as well. Don't forget one of the enduring things that happened in 2022 in the closing days of the election was a violent attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of the Speaker of the House, and this sense of political violence. In this case, the sense of political violence was against Donald Trump. And I think that was a powerful thing for a lot of voters.
Can I introduce one counterfactual? I had a Republican who said to me after the Republican convention that it was a blown Republican convention, that the messaging got, look, nobody knew how the convention was going to react to this. There were a lot of people wondering. I was on a plane with every other journalist that felt like that wasn't in Butler, right? And we had no Wi-Fi in our plane. Plane to Milwaukee, no Wi-Fi. So it wasn't until everybody landed, and I'm on with Kellyanne, Jake Tapper. It was the same, and everybody's like, and it was like complete dead silence, right, as everybody turns on their phones and everything comes through. But it did change the messaging of the convention. Mm-hmm. And I had some Republicans who were working on down ballot races who were like, we may go back and regret that it was, speaking as a Republican, that we didn't use the convention to prosecute the case against the Democrats enough. And it was one of those things where now I think, I totally where you are, the images were very powerful. And I think they served him really well. By the way, I don't know whether this caused an effect, but Elon Musk didn't get on board until that day. Whether he was always going to get on board or not, I don't know if we know. But if it truly was the moment he decided, you know what, I'm in, well, he turned out to be a pretty important player in this election in the last 60 days.
Yeah. I'd like to direct this question to start with to Anita and Molly, but I'd like everybody else who wants to comment to please jump in. Can you talk a little bit about how the President Biden's very strong support of Israel cross-pressured the Democratic coalition and constituency?
I think that we definitely saw protests starting in October of 2023, really until he dropped out. And then I think for a while, Harris was not getting protested. We had an extremely peaceful convention. I don't think he ever felt all that cross-pressured. I think, when it came to a matter of national security for this country, he felt very strongly about what to do. But he also made no secret of his efforts to get Israel to move when it came to getting aid into Gaza, and used, a number of tools, both publicly, but much more important, privately. I'd say more importantly, when it came to October 7th, 2023, it is difficult to describe how much time that started taking out of the president's schedule. I mean, those of us who've, worked in White Houses, you've all covered White Houses, but when you have that kind of event happen and the potential on top of the war in Ukraine, then foreign policy became a very paramount consideration, as it had been since he got there, but even more so. And in particular, the time spent around the war in the Mideast became really the dominant thing for a long time for this president. And so we were concerned. Obviously, we were concerned politically about what was happening. We did a lot of outreach. I think the campaign people did a lot of outreach because, by and large, we were hearing from people who had supported the president in 2020 who were disappointed, who were very disappointed, particularly in places like Dearborn, who felt like they had been there and that they thought Joe Biden was a certain kind of person. But I'll tell you, he is a president who was going to make decisions based on what he thought was in the best national security interests of this country. So it was a concern. It was I think it was never as big a concern as potentially some people thought, because the number of voters it affected were actually quite small. And even people who disagreed with him were still voting on other issues. So, it was one that I think personally was a very tough one for him. So I'll let Molly talk, though, to the politics.
Yeah, I'll talk to the numbers. I mean, we looked at this closely throughout, both qualitatively, meaning listening to voters who are bringing these topics up to us, and then also measuring these things in polls. And there was, of course, younger voters were much more focused on this issue. They were much more likely to say this was a top issue priority in this country, and an issue that they wanted the president and Congress focused on. It still was, that is relative to older age groups rather than relative to other issues. It still fell relatively low in ranked order behind economic issues. But the other piece is the issue that was most important versus which issue is vote driving. On this issue, typically those things go hand in hand. Your top issue is inflation. You are voting for the person you think is going to do a better job on it. It was not as correlated to vote choice, meaning I'm going to vote for the president or then the vice president versus Trump on this, as much as I think the bigger piece of damage that it did widely to Democrats was less about these far left protesters, or that was reflective of a much larger group of voters, as much as people felt like life had been incredibly chaotic. People felt like they wanted stability back. They voted for the president to bring back that sense of normalcy and stability. And all of a sudden, and this was, incredibly difficult imagery that was heavily, spread on social media, which is where young people get their news. And I think it created a larger sense of instability, that this is a scary world. Economically, this is scary. Globally, this is scary. And there are other things that, abortion, things like that all play into this larger sense. And I think that was a larger narrative challenge in this race. And that is where, not because voters thought necessarily that Trump was going to be better on this issue. Certainly those young voters actively were telling us they did not think that. But he was running a very, sort of paternalistic, I will make it better. I am, going to fix your problems. And I think that sort of contrast offset a very chaotic environment.
By the way, James Carville told me after the election he thought the biggest issue was a sense of disorder, which you've just echoed here. There's been a couple of fleeting references in our conversation to the debate. I want to go straight to that. Because I think it's fair to say the consensus was that Vice President Harris did well in that debate. Won is a strange term to use in a debate, but let's say she won the debate. I think there was an expectation in some quarters that would move the needle in a significant way. It maybe did briefly, but didn't really substantially. I'm curious, and this is for the group as a whole, why didn't that matter more than it did?
I'm happy to start.
Go.
So I will say that I think it mattered. I think what we often do, we're doing it in this discussion, we do it in politics, is it mattered if the vote moved. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's how we measured, does something matter? Did the vote move? And it is correct that this debate didn't move the vote. The assassination attempt did not move the vote. That doesn't mean it didn't matter. And so I would contend that her performance in the debate mattered a lot. And I think in two areas. One, I think that was the moment really where there was no more oxygen for this incompetence claim that they wanted to make. She did not come across incompetent. She did not come across uninformed. And so one of our lines of attack that, we did feel somewhat concerned about, how are we going to push this back, was that. I think the other piece was she came in with, as has been discussed, reasonably low expectations. This is where the expectations are the highest. This is where, if you are ready to say, okay, I just, I don't feel good about her, I'm going to listen to my inner voice that says just support Donald Trump, that would have been the moment. And so I think, in the butterfly effect of she didn't have a good debate performance, we would have potentially seen a major hole to dig out from. But I think just because her vote didn't move, I think it kept the race very competitive at a really crucial time. We also knew at that point that really was one of the final big moments, external moments that we could not create ourselves, where we were going to have a lot of eyeballs. And as voters were getting to know her, it was just really important to not just meet the moment, but exceed it. So I think it mattered, and also it certainly didn't move the vote.
She opened the door for voters who weren't sure about her. She came across as presidential, as prepared, as tough, as strong. And so I think that, I agree with Molly, I think people think, a debate is going to change everything. It's rare, it happens occasionally. But what it did was for particularly voters who did not know her very well, who knew who she was, maybe had a good impression, maybe had a bad impression, it made them feel that she was presidential. And so that was a critical piece as the campaign moved forward for her to build on top of. So even though they didn't necessarily say, I'm going to switch my vote, voters who, at least in our research, who had not been open to her, really had not been open to her, been kind of like I don't want to vote for Donald Trump, I'll probably end up doing it, were willing to go give her another look. And I think that was important to keeping it close.
Was there not a sense of, dread or disappointment, though, that it didn't move the vote? Because to your point, how many other opportunities do you have? Like, you've made the case, she's given a convention speech that was right down the middle, she had a very impressive debate performance, and it still felt like you just couldn't get there. At that point, was there not a level of like, if not now, when?
And let's not forget, at the end of the debate, Taylor Swift endorsed her.
Yeah, that's true.
And
Speaking of
There was
women
also,
vote.
well, I was just to jump in here for a second, on both of the reasons and why maybe the effect was blunted, starting with Trump for a second here. Recall that right before the Republican National Convention, President Biden had the press conference that he had. He also had COVID at the time. The assassination attempt happens. This is all taking place literally in the same exact week. Then you have, right after that, Biden ends up dropping out of the race. And so some of what happens here is that the conversation shifted then to, immediately from the assassination attempt to Biden is dropped. Now Kamala Harris is the candidate. So on that. When it comes to the debate itself, recall that there had been the hurricane that happened immediately after the debate took place as well. And so there were campaign stops that she had planned to make, places like Pennsylvania that she had planned to go back to and do some of the work that they planned to do in the central part of the state. I think there was a swing right after that was supposed to take place that ends up getting pulled down. She doesn't spend as much time in Nevada as well. And so there were this couple weeks where she ended up being at the White House instead. And so it's hard to distill into really just one thing about why all these things happen. But then, at least it seemed to me, that it was hard to get whatever momentum that there had been back. So then there's the shift to the democracy argument towards the end as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that end up happening, but perhaps you felt differently at the time.
I think, I'll go to Brendan's question first. I mean, certainly you always hope that some moment breaks through in a way that you see the numbers move, but that's just not how things work. I mean, I was hopeful but not expectant, I would say, of that. And I think also she was still so newly in the race, and voters are smarter than we want to give them credit for. They are more thoughtful and discerning. The notion that someone who we knew going into this, voters had very little backstory on and very little relationship with, was going to convert someone to a voter and that they would stick there, I think just felt somewhat out of the question, and this was going to have to be a little engine that could sort of case where you win every day. So I wished it, but I didn't expect it. And then in terms of the momentum, I mean, I don't know. I mean, pick a week this cycle, you know, I mean, everything only lasted so long. I don't.
But, yeah, and Alex, but the reverse question for you is how much fear was there within the Trump campaign after that debate that, oh my God, maybe there's a turn here?
Well, I think Molly's right, is that debates in general don't typically move numbers like maybe we would think they would. But I do agree with her completely that, you know, she did overperform what were maybe unfairly low expectations that had been set, and that allowed her to, you know, allowed voters to take another look at her and say, you know, hey, this is somebody that we're actually, or I could see myself voting for. And so she obviously won the media narrative. She won, you know, kind of the Beltway narrative, and you know, continued to you know, hold steady.
Doesn't she owe Donald Trump a thank you for lowering the expectations? I mean, in some ways,
Yeah.
he
Yes.
he alone
100%.
was the single force behind this idea that she wasn't bright.
Yes,
Right? He did it every day.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
I will say, I mean, the one thing that didn't get brought up here that I reflect on and felt this way at the time, and it wasn't our campaign, this was, you know, sort of organic things happening. One thing that was nice when she got into the race that we haven't discussed is she did have a social media engagement element where the people we needed to reactivate who are not going to follow traditional news sources or, you know, watch the debate in full, but they will catch moments. She had energy there. Trump had energy there. The president didn't really have energy there. So she was generating online conversations that also felt very good for us and felt new from, you know, sort of the energy we needed to have. A lot of what came out of the debate in terms of, again, I'm thinking about the voters that we cared about, all the voters, but the voters that we really knew we had to connect with every day were the voters who did not watch the debate. The younger voters who were going to see clips and snippets and produce content about it, but not watch the whole thing, and sort of take and latch onto these viral moments that way. That's really the people that we were thinking about. And the viral clip that came out of the debate was they're eating dogs and cats, and that is silly, and that's why it was viral, but I don't think that was helpful to the vice president. It circled back to immigration is a big, scary problem, and maybe it's not entirely factual, maybe it's you know, completely false, but at the bottom of it all is this sense that there is disorder, that there is fear, that there is chaos, and we all, I mean, we, like Royal, we laugh about it and it went very viral, but that became the talking point out of the debate for that community of voters who we really needed to reach. All of us here were like, she crushed it, she did great answers on these, held them accountable, all of that, but you know, again, we're talking about like, you know, this small group of voters that latch on to just a couple of things coming out of it.
Well, and I think the fact that the viral moment out of the debate was a Trump clip is telling, because although she won the debate in terms of skill and in terms of scoring points, the way that she won it was essentially prosecutorial. She baited Trump, and she had telegraphed that this was the strategy, and the Trump people were behind the scenes trying to get him not to take the bait, and he's incapable of that, so he did it over and over and over again. And so she made him look silly, and she got him to go down a lot of rabbit holes that reinforced a lot of the negative perceptions of him. But what she didn't do, and you can't do everything in a debate, and you know, it's possible to nitpick these performances. It was a strong performance on her part, but what she didn't really do in the course of that was fill in the blanks of who she was and take the opportunity to define herself more fully for voters. She was too focused, I think, on taking the fight to Trump, and so she scored a lot of points on him in that regard. But there weren't, to your point, a lot of clips that came out of the debate where she explained herself and gave voters a fuller picture of what exactly it was that she stood for.
Yeah. It's the Trump superpower, isn't it? The ability to be the subject of every conversation, no matter good or bad. So.
Going into Election Day, the polls showed a dead heat, possibly with some exceptions like the Des Moines Register poll, which is historically a very accurate poll, turned out to be completely wrong. I don't think anybody really thought, at least outside the Trump campaign, that he had a chance to win the popular vote. So were you surprised by the results?
Our polling actually always indicated that he had a good chance of winning the popular vote. I mean, in fact, that was, to me, the biggest because we saw that there was no movement in the battleground states, but he had improved his standing in the blue states. So it seemed inevitable that the winner was going to win the popular vote this time. So certainly, I felt like all the polling I saw, there was I'm not going to, I think our national poll's a little bit better than most, but all the polling seemed to indicate to me that it was more coin flippy on the popular vote this time than either of the previous. I mean, don't forget, this is the only Trump election that it was close, that the polling showed it close the entire time. In some ways, it's the only Trump election where the polling's been accurate. I mean, the last two both had, Clinton had a 6 to 8 point lead going into election day, if you believe the polling, and Biden had a approximately 5 to 7 point lead, right? So that is not what we ever saw in this election, at least in our polling.
Where do I Venmo you for saying that the polling was very accurate?
No,
this
I'm
cycle?
on a, the only thing that has destroyed the reputation of polling are the polling aggregators. 538 and Real Clear Politics mislead. They don't help you understand the polling. They're off my soapbox. Sorry.
But they
I think those two things have
Venmo's
ruined.
filling up for you.
Yeah, I think they've ruined people's understanding of polling.
But they also had a coin flip race.
Sure.
Our
Okay.
final poll had Trump on points.
Nate Silver
So
got it
just-
right in 2008
points.
when everybody could get it right in 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our final poll had Trump up by 2, so, okay. But I think the question's more about the blue states. Did people actually think all the whole wall of blue states would go Trump? That was the bigger surprise. I think that's fair to say.
So I'll speak to Pennsylvania first. It was starting to feel like it was not gonna go Kamala Harris's way several weeks before the election. Just looking at going back to the shortened amount of time that she had to do all the things that I know that the campaign wanted to do. One thing that the campaign had tried to do was try to recreate the playbook that had gotten John Fetterman and Josh Shapiro elected in the state of Pennsylvania. And with more time, understandably, that's something that probably could have been recreated in terms of reaching out to the anti-Trump Republican voters that were in the suburban counties, reaching out to more independents, and stuff like that. But in the amount of time that the campaign had, as you were talking about trying to reintroduce her to voters, you had to also introduce her running mate nationally to voters as well, lay out what her platform would be and how that was gonna be different than the platform that Joe Biden had, draw the contrast with Donald Trump. There were all these things that the campaign was trying to do. At the same time, not necessarily run on the same coalition that Biden ran on, because he had relied really hard on white working class men, and she was running on women, suburban women. She was trying to get more youth voters out. Obviously, black voters were a huge focus for the campaign. All of the things that they were trying to do, doing that, as you were talking about, in the number of battleground states that they were trying to hit, including North Carolina, which was the state that Biden had lost in the previous election that they were trying to win, brings you to a situation where she was spread really thin in terms of her time, and in Pennsylvania in particular, they had tried to go to the western part of the state in these counties that were around Pittsburgh to try and push down Trump's margins, cut into his voters. The theory wasn't necessarily that you're going to win in those counties, but if they could just do better in those counties and rack up votes across the state. She didn't go to Philadelphia, which is a huge part of the Democratic vote, for several weeks, and this is where the hurricane also comes in, when she didn't travel for a while. She never went to Allentown in Pennsylvania until the very last day of the campaign, even though the Hispanic vote and the fact that that had become majority Hispanic in Allentown was something that the campaign knew was an issue. And that's not to say the campaign didn't know that these were places they should be or things that they should be doing, but it seemed to be just a function of time. And when you saw that happening in Pennsylvania, it was largely, as we talked about Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, there were similar problems playing out across those states.
I gotta say, from my side, I mean, President Trump was actually pretty bullish on winning the popular vote, and told staff and I think made a couple public comments that, hey, we could win the popular vote. Now, as staff, you always want to temper expectations, but truly, I mean, he was seen our numbers with certain segments of voters, the coalition that we were trying to build, whether it was traditional union working voters in the upper blue wall states, or Hispanics or black men. Our numbers we were so bullish on those numbers with those segments of voters that it was bound to translate over to California, to New York, and elsewhere, in New Jersey, and ultimately that's why you saw some of the historic results from traditionally blue states.
The Republicans were also doing well in the early vote, and there was a line from the Democrats that this was just because they were cannibalizing their election day vote. But from what I understand, the Trump campaign had data, and they knew that those were new voters, and that they were locking down a lot of their vote in advance of election day.
Which is a totally new phenomenon, right? Changed.
And that was a result of a massive effort on the part of the campaign, both to convince the president that early and mail-in voting was something he could encourage. He should encourage his voters
Alex is nodding
to
his
do.
head and smiling here.
And then also to build the infrastructure to get those people to return their ballots.
Because so many of our voters were distrustful of early voting.
Yeah, wonder why.
Where'd they get that idea?
But even in some states like Florida, Republicans or my home state of Iowa, like we are used to voting early.
Yeah.
It's a thing that we've always done. Other states, and obviously this is pre some of the changes to the laws after COVID or before COVID, but after COVID, in many cases it's easier to do that. But it's a cultural shift. It's a cultural change that you've got to educate your voters about.
It's sort of funny to me. Florida Republicans invented the early vote.
Yeah.
And it was all because of the snowbirds.
Right.
Right. It was all because they needed to figure out a way to make sure they didn't lose out on the snowbird vote, because the snowbirds were in Southwest Florida. And so the irony to this is literally the early vote was a weapon that the Republicans used quite well in the first decade of this century. Then the Obama campaign said, okay, we gotta, and it was in Iowa that they first started to figure this out, actually. And then it became a Democratic strength for about 2 cycles. But it is a reminder that each party sort of learns from the other, and it's always the out party that innovates. The incumbent party never innovates as much as they think they are.
Because
Taking
they just
notes
won,
here.
right?
No, but it's true. There is some lack of, because you think, well, I've won. I don't have to innovate as much as you do. When you're the challenger, they're losing is a force of it.
So we want to take apart some of the vote at the end, what happened bit by bit in this after our break. But before we get to the break, it occurs to me there are 2 names that haven't even been mentioned here: J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, though somebody referred to him
I referred
obliquely.
to the running mate.
Yeah, exactly. What difference, if any, did those 2 characters make? Did they bring anybody in, send anybody out, or was it a non-factor? And open to all here.
My observation, I think they made each of the top of the ticket feel better about themselves, and I mean this in a positive. I think Vance was good for Trump's psyche, and I think Walz was good for Harris's psyche. And then sometimes that's all you want from a running mate. But I don't think either one of them, they ended up with the same fave on fave by the end. It's just something like 40 to 40, 38 to 38, something like that. It ended up a non-factor.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I won't speak in my capacity with the Harris campaign. Just Molly Murphy thinks vice president choices can only hurt you if you do it badly and otherwise do very little for you. I think we spend a lot more time in the lead up to it, gamesmanshiping, from where, to whom, what background, and it's a necessary conversation. You want to be mindful of those things. But I look at that, your best case outcome is by considering all of those different factors, the person's background, their life experience, their home state, all of those things. It is just to, guard against making a mistake and choosing someone who is a bad fit. I think if you choose someone who is a spectacularly bad running mate for you, then voters will knock you down for poor judgment, and then that's a problem for you. But I think if you choose someone who is an appropriate fit and kind of meets, you partner well with and all of that, and I think Vance and Walz more than did that for their running mates, I think the voters don't think very much about it.
Brendan, you actually worked on a vice presidential campaign, so you have to speak up here.
Yeah, I worked for Paul Ryan when he was running for VP, and we lost Wisconsin, so it tells you how much good that does for you.
But you carried his district.
Yeah, no, I guess it depends, like, what did you want your VP to be doing? I don't know if this is how the campaign meant for Tim Walz to be used, but it was certainly positioned in the media that, like, he was their way to reach men. And if that's really what was going on, it may not be. I don't know that he was really the right guy to do that. He seemed like a sort of Democrat's imagination of what a red state guy would like going.
Brendan, I'm glad you said it.
Like the sort of Elmer Fudd impression, going hunting and everything. You know, I don't know that really.
Look at my plaid shirts.
Right. It felt like he was.
I've been to Cabela's.
So I don't know Tim Walz, but I was in the House when he was serving, and I when he was presented as like the authentic real man, I sort of remember him as a bit of a try-hard in the House, like always having the line, always having the shtick. So it never really resonated with me. That doesn't mean it wouldn't resonate with other people. So a long way of saying I'm not sure that he really added anything, and if their plan was we're going to pick him because he's going to help us do this, then I don't think that was really successful. But to Molly's point, I don't know that it really matters, so maybe that's not what they were doing, but I don't know that he added.
Can I just make one counterfactual?
Yeah.
And that is, because for me, I think the only VP pick that truly had an impact was Joe Lieberman, and how it allowed Al Gore at a moment that he needed to separate himself, and it worked. To this day, I think the race.
Well, it worked up to a point.
Well, I think it worked. I mean, meaning I don't know if Gore gets there without sort of changing the conversation there a little bit. And what did Lieberman do? It allowed Gore to separate from Clinton. And she could have found a VP pick that maybe tried that more. I don't know who exactly that could have been.
Well, you know who it is, the governor of Pennsylvania.
Well, I don't know if he was an anti-Biden pick, though. I don't think that would have meant the separation from Biden.
But as a tactical pick, that's the second. Yeah. That's the Monday morning.
But that would be the only thing, and even that, I still think at the end of the day, it means about 10,000 votes.
So in terms of the what if she had picked Josh Shapiro, I wrote a whole entire story about this. What if she had picked Josh Shapiro? I mean, yeah, there was the idea that maybe that would have helped you by a point and a half in Pennsylvania. Then maybe she would have won Pennsylvania. I mean, if she had won Pennsylvania, she still would have lost the election. So would it really have mattered in the end? But the reason that she went with Tim Walz was because, according to my sources, was that she just had better chemistry with him. And it wasn't a question of at the time, like, do I think that Tim Walz is necessarily going to somehow win me this election? It was, if I win the election, who do I want as my right-hand person, who I want serving with me, shoring me up for when I run for re-election? Who do I want to spend the next 4 and potentially 8 years with? And when you looked at someone like Josh Shapiro, who is seen as very ambitious, he is seen as someone who has his own presidential ambitions, there was a concern about some people that he would either be more interested in his own ambitions and setting himself up in that way. There was also even a concern from folks that are supportive of him that it wouldn't be in his interest to be on the ticket, because what if what had ended up happening the way it ended up happening is that then Harris loses, and then he has to own that before he ever even had a chance to run his own campaign and define himself and be tied to that. So I guess as we're back in the land of counterfactuals here, there's so many that you can run in that situation. But I do think you make a really good point about the Wisconsin argument.
Yeah. So I've been involved in 2 vice presidential search processes, and people don't bring states. John Edwards didn't bring North Carolina. Lloyd Benson didn't bring Texas. Paul Ryan didn't bring Wisconsin. So this idea that somehow there's this magical pick that's going to bring a state, and I do not believe Josh Shapiro would have brought Pennsylvania. So and Molly is like agreeing with me. So yes. That means there's data. Yes. But by the way, I'm a huge fan of his. But vice presidents are not what you vote on. I would disagree with Chuck a little, though. I think the worst vice presidential choice and the most consequential was in 2008, when John McCain picked Sarah Palin.
Oh, yeah.
Totally undercut his brand, right? His brand totally undercut his claim.
I will debate you on that. I
Okay,
actually
will you
think.
debate me on that?
I will say this. I think, though, she kept, you guys would have won a bigger landslide in 08 without her. She kept Georgia in play. She kept a few of these states that were, I take your point that it undercut the John McCain brand, hard stop. She kept evangelicals from leaving the party. So there's anyway,
But
what
I
I'm
think
saying
that-
is
but I
that I
think
take your point, but I think she actually weirdly helped McCain in some parts of the electorate.
Yeah, I
That's-
remember being at those rallies in the fall of 2008 where John McCain could not fill a room,
But
and
she
she was
could.
getting 20,000.
That's right. But I would also say that I think she accelerated what is now, what has been happening, which was college-educated voters leaving the Republican Party. And if you look at 2008, you'll see a huge bump up in that number.
I think they
has
take that
continued.
trade.
Could
Yeah.
I would
Turns
also.
out they've taken that trade.
They have taken that trade, for
I mean,
now.
if we also take it like, sort of like the impact on a race, I think it did mess with his brand. I think it made people question his judgment. I also think she constantly threw that campaign off message. And so I also think day in and day out, they were responding to things she was doing. And so they were then having to defend or deflect or all of that. And I think that anytime your campaign is not on your message and driving your, which they had a hard time doing because of Obama.
But were they winning that election under any circumstance? I mean, there's,
Yes,
right,
yes,
you know what I
for
mean?
sure,
So
for
we don't
sure.
know, right? And
We don't know.
Yeah,
We
in
don't.
fairness, we don't
Yeah.
know.
Before we go too far down the 2008 rabbit hole, I mean, the person whose vice presidential choice made the most difference in this race obviously was Joe Biden. But
Yeah.
I do think.
Actually, do we go back to Barack Obama? Yeah. Well, anyway, sorry.
Fair enough.
The blame pie goes back deep in my brain.
But there was this conventional wisdom after Trump picked J.D. Vance that this was a terrible idea because it was just doubling down on his base.
Wasn't it conventional wisdom? It was Kellyanne Conway screaming at the top of her lungs that J.D. Vance is a bad pick.
That might have had something to do with it. But this idea that, by doubling down on this sort of, populist nationalist ideology that was already sort of in his corner, that this was a mistake because he was just reinforcing a group that was already with him. But I think in hindsight, that was intentional. If you look at the whole of the Republican convention, right, this very hardcore sort of masculinist Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt, and then all the bro podcasts that Trump went on. It was an intentional strategy on the Trump campaign's part to double down on this base because their theory of the electorate was that there were more of those disaffected voters, particularly among younger men, that they could go out and get in the battleground states that they could use to reshape the electorate. And so they didn't see that as a negative, even when a lot of us did. And then I think the vice presidential debate also mattered, because I think that was a disaster for Tim Walz in a way that really undercut both Kamala Harris's judgment and also the sort of competency argument, the idea that she was ready to be president and to go into the White House, because he did not look ready. And then on the other side, I was perplexed by the fact that they kept him in a box. He didn't do any, he got on the ticket by going on MSNBC and being likable, and that's why she picked him, and then they didn't let him do any more interviews. And so I think he was likable in a lot of ways, but he never got a chance to show that, and I don't know, maybe you can speak to whether they were afraid he'd overshadow her, or that it was just part of a general media strategy that was very cautious and locked down. But they didn't give him an opportunity to go out and be an asset to the campaign. And then the final thing I'll say about Josh Shapiro is I think the potential upside of a Shapiro pick was not only that he was popular in Pennsylvania, but that it would have been an overt punch in the face of the far left. And that was something she was unwilling or unable to do over the course of the campaign. And had she been able to do that, it might have made her better able to appeal to the center of the electorate in a way that she wasn't able to do.
They did end up sending Tim Walz on Fox News Sunday to go speak to Republicans towards the end, by the way. Yeah, really one. I think maybe twice. Didn't they end up doing it?
When I was working for Paul Ryan, we would do 4 to 8 interviews a day.
And Vance was doing that.
That was the job, and that's what Tim Vance was doing. It was just bizarre that he didn't do much of anything.
Okay, we've reached a point where we'd like to take a break. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock. I would ask all the panelists to try to be back up here by 4. That's only 11 minutes. We've cut into your break by 4 minutes. And I would ask everybody who's here today to please don't grab the panelists and hang on to them for 20 minutes or something. So, but it's been a great first session, and we're looking forward to our second session.
See where that wall of pictures is? Just go here. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know where it is, Jerry? I can take him. Downstairs? Yeah.
The elevator down.
You can take the elevator or the steps in the back hall.
Not too many questions. I put Will's on top.
Okay.
And you can have a look if you want to.
We probably will. This is going a lot faster than, it's just rolling along very nicely, so.
Maybe I'll check if any of them. I think at this point they all know where the restrooms are.
Yeah. I will, I have time, I will add that in, because that's a great question, because you had Secretary Clinton, and now you've had Vice President Harris, and then on the Republican side, you had Nikki Haley, who was a very credible candidate, and so I think that's a great point. You know, it's rolling a lot faster. Hey, how you doing? Good. Thank you. I put on some weight, but it's time to get that off. But yeah, I guess so. I am really surprised. It's going quickly. And it's really funny because maybe all along we should have been doing one longer session and never run into that second day, because you know you had a what I, as best I could tell, is a complete full house.
We kind of banked on the fact that it would help us get some higher level people in a short time.
Yeah. I used to always get so frustrated, Audrey, on the second day.
The rhythm of life has changed so much in the last 5 years since COVID, so I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, but you're right. You're right.
I think our long form is so fast. I'm sitting here thinking, what a luxury, what an investment it is to sit, listen, and digest, and have all these people talk, and it's just not something that we get in life regular. We go to church.
Testing, testing. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Just a little 2-minute warning that will be starting in 2 minutes. If you could please take your seats. Oh, they turned it off again. Hello? Perfect. Could you hear me? Hello, testing. Okay, now. Hey everyone, just again, a 2-minute warning that we'll be starting the panel again in 2 minutes if you could take your seats. Thank you.
Hello? Unfortunately, the mics aren't working, so. No, the mics, no, I was going to do it too.
That's why.
I'm going to stop. Some key exit poll data. And then we can go to your next question. All right. Can everyone hear? I can't tell if the mic's on or not. Okay, it's good. 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 Welcome back to session 2. We've got a lot more material to cover, but we're moving very quickly, quicker than maybe I expected. What I'd like to do to start the second session is to call on Molly Murphy, who is, as you know, a Democratic pollster, and ask her to talk about some of what she thought were key findings in the end of campaign and exit polls, and then maybe ask some of the other panelists to jump in and talk about what you found as extremely interesting about the way this election turned out.
Eve, there we go. We've talked about some of these things, so on those points I'll be more brief to just not rehash, but these are the things that I think are the most interesting, both in terms of what happened and then also as we reflect on future elections and what it means. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is we're talking about this election as a realignment. And what does realignment mean? It means you've got voters who we assumed were bedrock Democratic voters who bled and moved to the right in profound ways. So, I mean, the biggest takeaways are young voters, particularly men, but also younger women did move towards Republicans. That sort of, gap that we hoped expanded potentially on both sides. I mean, our goal was to sort of move younger women, as we saw in 2022, more towards the vice president, to in some ways offset. We wanted to obviously blunt, but also offset what we saw as fairly likely younger men moving over more towards Republicans than they had in 2020. Both groups moved right, but it was certainly the swing we saw was because of men. The same is true when we talk about different communities of color, and that really is any racial or ethnic group. There are, we can talk about AAPI voters, Black voters, and Latino voters. Again, both genders moved, Black women barely, but everyone else moved a bit. And those men, whether they were Black men, AAPI, or Latino voters, shifted 20 points for Latino men, 26 points with Black men. Young voters, meaning under the age of 30, shifted 21 points towards Republicans. And I think that's, the question about this realignment. Was that a fixed moment in time? Is that something that is a reaction to this current environment, to the nature of the campaign, and to Trump and what he brings? Or is this an indicator that these coalitions are never as firm as we want them to be, and campaigns should never fight the last war, but instead look at the sort of data and where people are now? But I think what I am the most struck by, and when people want to attribute a lot of different reasons for the outcome of this race, the biggest swings happened among lowest education attainment, lowest income voters, highest cost of living areas. And if you look at those, and those have the biggest shifts, and that's true if it's in California or New Jersey or Florida or a swing state, your highest, most expensive cost of living areas had the biggest swing to the right, and your lowest income, lowest education areas also had, voters had that biggest swing. It's hard to conclude that this election wasn't at least driven in large or almost entirely by people's economic lives. And I think that, those are the things that I find to be in the data the most imperative that we understand moving forward. Is this temporal or is it permanent? The other piece that we've covered that I was, and I was preparing some of the things here in terms of what's interesting is whether we want to call it ticket splitters, I would say ticket splitted outcomes, whether it's the voter, that individual voter splitting their ticket, but the sort of split ticket outcome in a lot of these Senate and gubernatorial races. We saw more of that in Senate races this cycle than we had in the past two presidentials. In 2016 and in 2020, there was one Senate race that went for one party at the presidential level and the other party at the Senate level. That was Maine in 2020 for Susan Collins. And this cycle, you had Arizona, you had Nevada, you had Michigan, you had Wisconsin. Am I missing one?
North Carolina.
North Carolina gubernatorial and New Hampshire on the other side in the gubernatorial voted for Vice President Harris and elected Kelly Ayotte as governor. And so when you dig into that and you look at what's underneath it, it very much was people voting for Trump and then leaving. They weren't necessarily saying, I like Trump, but I want to check on him, so I'm voting for the Democrat. And so moving forward, we, both parties, I think, need to understand what these coalitions are looking for, why they voted the way they do. But I think I also look at these and say, why was it Trump and no one else? Because that is less sustainable, I think, for Republicans moving forward, unless there is a fix to that. So I think those were the things I was most interested in and trends in this election.
I had two observations that I've learned sort of post-election. One is sort of I want us to almost all, let's not overdo the realignment talk. Because in some ways, this was a very simple election. You had an unpopular president. You had a vice president trying to succeed an unpopular president. That's never happened. The only vice president in any of our lifetimes to win the presidency, succeeding a living president, had a 63% approval rating on election day. Bill Clinton had a good job rating, but he didn't have a good personal rating. That was a drag. Nixon had his own drag. I mean, it is really hard to win an election as the incumbent party when the sitting president is at 40% approval, which he's been at for 2 straight years, and when nobody likes the economy, right? We can have a debate about, no, but the economy is healing. Doesn't matter. They don't like this economy.
Well, plus inflation is just a drag on an incumbent. Period,
Inflation
full stop.
destroyed 3 presidencies in the 70s.
Yeah.
Okay, Nixon survives Watergate if the economy's better. Ford wins if the economy's better. Carter wins re-election if the economy's better.
But it's inflation
Yeah.
specifically.
Specific,
yeah,
100%. But the second thing, and this is always my favorite part about a post-election, is the losing side suddenly shares memos that they never would have shared with you. And I got one from a
Molly brought some today. But
right, one,
Sure your
a
pamphlets on the way out.
Biden, a strategist for a Biden super PAC circa 2022, sent me a polling memo that he had sent to the campaign, and there was a single. He wanted me to note a single observation that he had made at the end, and it was having to do with the Latino vote. And what was interesting, they were asking all sorts of questions, and they were testing the democracy question. And one of the things that popped out to this source of mine, and he put it in his memo and he circled it to make sure I didn't miss it, was that Hispanics believed in a strong presidency. They were more open to a strong presidency. And in fact, were more, so this idea of the authoritarianism and this and that. And there was another aspect to it. The democracy message really didn't ring true with Latino voters, especially if they're first or second gen. Because first, you want to see a democracy crumbling? Let me introduce you to El Salvador. You want to see a democracy that doesn't work? Let me introduce you to Venezuela. And so it was one of those things that the Hispanic voters want a strong presidency, and they were more open to it, which was sort of this, at the time, he was right, like Trump may make more inroads here than you think. And then the other aspect of Latino voters is that the Trump campaign targeted them on the same issues they were targeting working class white voters. Mm-hmm. And the Harris campaign targeted them as a community of color. And that's where I think the disconnect has sort of, and it's sort of like, going forward, I think it's pretty clear class is the big divide in American politics, not identity. And I think I think both parties are sort of now get that in many ways, and I suspect a different sort of Democratic messaging in the next 4 years because of that.
Sorry, Mel, go ahead.
I was just wondering, I'd love to hear from Molly and Anita about, given that this was showing up in all of the crosstabs of the public polling and we'd seen it start to happen in 2022, to what extent was the alarm being sounded within the campaign? Because the public message was a lot of denial that this was happening and an insistence that these groups were all going to come home in the final vote.
I mean, I don't know that I think we, even in our public comments, acknowledged that we saw it. We obviously sort of had hope and optimism that they would come back, but we saw it the whole time. I mean, if you look at the way we spent our resources heavily on digital, for instance, it's to reach those voters who are not consuming traditional media, broadcast television, that sort of thing. I think we made a lot of strategic decisions and spending decisions to try to reach those voters. One, it's hard to reach them, and so finding them where they are was a big imperative. But it was, I can't overstate how important those groups were and how forefront they were in, all of the analysis and all the polling and all the poll briefings and all the paid communication, and I assume that was true at Future Forward based on everything I know about what you all did.
Totally true about Future Forward, and when Molly talks about this, this was true for the Biden campaign as well as the Harris campaign. Yep. So this was not something we weren't tracking, it was something that people were singularly focused on. And certainly, just from a Future Forward perspective, a huge number of resources there at the end, throughout the campaign, targeted very much towards those communities, yeah. And with an economic message,
mm-hmm.
So was there, sorry, one more thing. Was there a discussion of getting the vice president to lean more overtly into the historic nature of her candidacy? Because she was very aggressive about sort of downplaying that. Was there a feeling that it would backfire?
I wasn't part of conversations should she or shouldn't she, because I do think actually that came from her, was she wanted to introduce herself to voters. And I also think probably we never really had discussions about this because, one, I think identity politics don't drive votes. So the historic nature of her candidacy, I don't think was going to be the reason someone went from sitting on the fence to voting for her. It may be the reason that somebody voting for her feels even more excited about doing so. I think the other piece was, though, that these voters were telling us, they tell us in how they voted, which was not for us, but they were telling us all along, I am unhappy, my life is hard, everything is too expensive. The idea that they would be like, but I love that she'll be the first is just not a conclusion those voters are going to make. So, I mean, it almost, I mean, she did avoid it. I don't know if it would, you know, I don't know that I would say so tactically avoid it because one doesn't equal two, but it just would have completely missed the mark in terms of meeting people where they were. Yeah.
Of all the great lines that Bill Clinton has gotten off over the years, my favorite that I come back to time and time again is in 1992 when he was being pursued over the Vietnam draft dodging, Jennifer Flowers. He had this great riff. He said, voters care. He said, the Republicans care more about my past than about your future. And he made it about the voters. He said, the other guys care more about my past than your future. Always made it about them, the voters, because this is a selfie. Voters care about number one. They're in it for themselves. What have you done for me? This is not JFK, ask not, man. Voters want to know, like, what are you doing for me, politician? And that to me was, you can boil the Trump's victory down to just that fact. The voters looked around and said, this isn't working for me. And the other guy was better, and that's why I'm voting for the other guy. It's just not that much more complicated than that. And Chuck, on the inflation thing, it's funny when I actually caught Clinton in North Carolina for a day and a half, and he was in pretty small towns. And there was one stop, it was Wilson, North Carolina, where, you know, as Clinton's wont to do, he occasionally blurts out the truth. And he said, I saw what happened to Jimmy Carter on inflation. I can't quite do it justice, but he mentioned Carter in 1980, and he was trying to do this sort of like.
He's stuck on that 1980 election because the only one he ever lost. So.
Has never forgotten or forgiven Jimmy Carter.
Never forgiven Carter.
Exactly. They sent those refugees to Fort Chaffee. I couldn't come back. No, but you know, he couldn't help himself because he was trying to do the explainer in chief. This is why inflation was so bad globally. The supply chains, you see, it really hurt after COVID, and that's why we all paid a price for it. And grocery consolidation and he was brilliant at it. But then he just blurts out, I saw what happened in '80 with Carter, and it was almost like, oh, he just said it out loud.
Hey, Anita, address this.
Inflation's a killer.
I heard President Biden sort of lament that he didn't sign the checks.
Yes.
I thought that was an interesting blurt.
That came up with voters so much, right?
Talk about the accidental speaking the truth. He goes, I guess I should have signed the damn check.
Yes, yes.
What is he? Is he been muttering about that a little bit?
I haven't been there for that, Chuck.
Fair.
So, okay.
Okay. So, Alex, I want to bring you in on this because, you know, as Molly said at the outset of this conversation, made inroads with, you know, Hispanics, with blacks, particularly black males, with young men in general. Not an accident, because you guys had a very conscious social media, podcast, direct to live streaming strategy to reach those audiences. Talk about what that strategy was and what was different about it.
Yeah, we knew from the beginning that we had to assemble a pretty diverse coalition, again, of some voters who don't traditionally vote for Republicans, and obviously we've seen the effects of that down ballot. But that includes libertarians, right? And that's why the president made a conscious decision to go to the National Libertarian Convention, which I can tell you is kind of a wild affair.
No.
That's on C-SPAN at night. Yeah,
exactly.
After dark.
Exactly. You know, the president loves going to UFC fights, but, you know, there's a reason why we went to so many, right, to appeal to younger men, Hispanic men, black men, you know, doing a rally in the Bronx. It's not because we thought we were going to win the Bronx, but it was to message to those particular voters, no tax on tips, something that the president thought of, hey, this would help some of the wage earners that are in, across the country, but particularly in a state like Nevada. And so you start to do these things, and they have a cumulative effect and a cumulative message to different segments of voters. I mean, we did a lot of work with the Mormon community in Arizona and Nevada, pretty sizable portion of the electorate. And so, we're seeing the results of that borne out, in Clark County, for example, which is a third, Clark County, Nevada, third Hispanic. That went from a +9 Biden county to a +3 Harris, right? We had a 6-point shift there, and that's 70% of the state's population there. Some other counties, Jefferson County, Georgia, 51% African American. President Trump won that county by 1 point when it was won by Biden by 7 points. So, we're seeing all of those effects add up. Obviously, the podcast you mentioned, Joe Rogan, this non-traditional forms of media that younger voters gravitate towards and get their media from. Elon Musk's support, reaching different voters. And we had an entire field program that was simply geared towards going after low propensity, Trump-leaning voters. Maybe they didn't participate in the last primary. Maybe they didn't vote in 2020, but they voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And so we had a conscious decision that we developed during the Iowa caucuses to implement a 10 for Trump program where, in traditional campaigns, and we took a lot of flack for this because, a lot of people said, well, you don't have thousands of organizers or tens of thousands of organizers across the country. You don't have thousands of offices, all of which take a tremendous amount of resources, staff, and time. But, what we did have and what Donald Trump is unique in his candidacy is an incredibly motivated group of volunteers who are willing to go out and call or meet 10 strangers and convince them to go to the polls or even bring them to the polls on election day or, again, as we mentioned before, to vote early. Get these people to return their ballots. So we call it the 10 for Trump program, and it was a way to create a bite-sized action for our most engaged and passionate supporters.
And the Harris campaign tried to do some of those same exact things, but they didn't have the same exact effect, right? So she went on podcasts. Notably, she went on the Call Her Daddy podcast to try and get to the low propensity voters because they also determined that they needed to try and pull in some of those people. She also tried to create some of those moments in the campaign. Think back to Houston when she had the Beyonce rally, the reproductive freedom. It was a reproductive freedom event is what they called it, abortion rights. She also had the democracy speech on the ellipse at the White House on the lawn, and it just in the end didn't end up having the same exact effect, I think, as when Trump's team ended up doing those things. We could also talk about the message of democracy as the close when we're talking about the economy, whether she should have been focused more on the economy. But when it comes to the gender gap specifically, and we talk about exit polling, one thing that stood out to me is that in exit polling by the networks, that there was a plus 12 for Trump, so that was wider than the margin for Biden. He did better with men. And then among women, it was plus 8 for Harris. But Biden won women by 15 points. So for all the focus on women and abortion rights, which had always been Vice President Harris's strategy, right, because of 2022 and the fact that she had led on the issue and the fact that it had done so well, even in a place like Kansas when abortion rights were on the ballot, the Harris team thought that they could really turn out women with this issue, including not just the suburban women, but including Republican women would come out on this issue, and you just didn't see that bear out in the election the way that her team thought that it would. And I do think that this largely goes back to the economic question. Voters were consistently saying in poll after poll after poll that the economy and inflation were their number one issue, not democracy, not abortion rights, not unity, not these other messages. And yet there was a consistent focus towards the end on many of those issues rather than every single day just driving home the economic message.
Hey, I got a question for Molly, because I think Trump should get more credit for inoculating himself on abortion.
Yeah.
And I don't think, like, what he did in Florida was when he was like, I don't like this. I don't want to, and then he gets pressure to vote for it, but he had to be dragged to it. And I'm curious, like, here's a counterfactual we don't know, Francesca, which is if he had the Ron DeSantis position on abortion, does abortion rise up in importance? And does the gender, I mean, how much did Trump's ability to inoculate himself on this issue sort of make it harder for you to create a gender gap?
So the gender gap, I'm trying to figure out which part to start on first. I will talk about the abortion part first, then I'll talk about sort of the impact that I think it had on the gender gap. Going into this race early on, even before the Florida remarks, Trump is masterful at being impossible to pin down on things. We did very early research, very early in early 2023, coming out of the midterms, on what is his brand relative to abortion. What do people think will happen if he's president on the issue of abortion? How afraid of Trump being president are abortion voters. And what we found very early is that, especially for the voters we needed to win, the people who were concerned about abortion, those abortion voters, they're very scared of Trump, right? Like, if you are concerned about that issue, you have made up your mind. But for voters who could vote on the issue, for voters that it mattered if they felt like it was truly threatened, they had no memory, and they're not, civics is not front of mind for a lot of these voters who also care about inflation, and they also care about, the border. They care about a lot of issues. They did not know, they did not remember his role in the Dobbs decision. They don't think about Supreme Court nominees and litmus tests or any of those things.
It's such a big ask of the electorate,
It's
right?
huge.
Yeah.
It's and in a way that I hold no judgment. That is just a fact. If you barely follow politics, like, why would you think about that? And Dobbs happened not when Trump was president. Not that they think Biden caused it, but they just
some
didn't.
Voters think that?
Some, I think that was massively overplayed. I never saw anyone say they thought Joe Biden took us back on abortion rights. That was not a perception that we had to address. But they didn't really think that he had a role in it. They didn't think he cared about the issue. They thought maybe he was against abortion, but that is not what got him out of bed every morning. And so that was our challenge, was doing a little bit of connecting the dots, because you got to give people the reason that they want to listen to you, and then showing them what he was capable of doing through his prior actions, and that this wasn't a vote just to punish him for Dobbs, but to guard against whatever could come in a second term. That's a lot. It's a lot to give voters. Ultimately, those numbers did not shift much from where he started out in terms of metrics of how concerned are you that he's going to try to ban abortion or restrict abortion or sign an abortion ban. They stayed below the numbers we needed, even among women voters. And I think some of it is his own actions and what he was able to do to be slippery on it. I think it worked well against Republicans in some of the Senate states where they were much more ideological on it, and you had tape and you were able to make a clearer, more concise argument on it. How do I think it contributed to the gender gap? In the counterfactual where he had that position, I do think we do better with women. But I still think that what we learned in this election is the types of new voters who showed up, the people who weren't there in the midterms. The people who showed up to vote on abortion in the midterms still voted against Donald Trump. But there is that new crop of voters. They didn't care about abortion in 2022, or else they would have voted. They were motivated by economic issues, and I just think that was our gender gap problem much more so than
Yeah,
abortion.
the Republicans now do better in larger turnout elections, which is the opposite of what it was 10 years ago. I also think that Trump was inoculated, Chuck, to borrow your phrase, in part just by his character. It's hard to sell him as like a stern, judgmental Jerry Falwell type figure. He's not, right? He's a celebrity from TV who everybody knows is kind of a playboy over the years. I can't remember who wrote this, but it was really insightful that one of the secrets to the success of sort of right-wing populists around the world, whether it's Boris Johnson, Berlusconi, or Trump, is they all evade the perception of being sort of starchy, far-right, down-the-line conservatives because their personal lives are so florid, right? Like, nobody's going to say, like, those guys are somehow going to be, like, judgmental on cultural issues because their own lives that they've led are obviously not. And so he benefits in some ways with the voters from being the opposite of kind of the Christian coalition, a button-down type. It's
Well,
like,
it sounds like anybody can join the Trump campaign. He doesn't judge you, right? And there's this mindset of, right, Republicans aren't telling you how to. It used to be the Republicans were telling you how to live, and the Democrats were the ones who are not going to tell you how to live. And now somehow the roles got flipped, where the Democrats are telling you how to speak, what you should say in public,
or what straw to use.
Yeah. And it's the Republicans are like, hey, come on in. We're not going to judge.
I think the same dynamic with the podcast all kind of comes together on the issue of the sort of fascism argument that was made. Like, he'll go on these podcasts and he'll talk about sports and he'll be like a regular guy, and people are like, this isn't Hitler. So it just doesn't quite land in the same way, and it sort of inoculates him from some of that like dark, brooded, dark language that you heard.
What proportion of the paid advertising was about abortion?
The figure I saw was 22%. Somebody will fact check me on that on the campaign, but I think it was around 22% all in, on the Harris.
But I want to bring up that point you just made, because the Senate folks made this point strong, right? Which is the videotape on the Republican candidates was very much more strident on the issue.
Yes.
And it was constant in the TV ads, which is why it was effective. The problem, but I'd even go back with Trump, all the previous tape on him on abortion's all over the place, too. So it's like you couldn't go to the videotape. So so I take your point that he inoculated himself basically the minute he came down the escalator.
I do also think to the strategy of the Trump campaign. So he, said what he said in Florida. He, kind of says everything on it. They were in mailboxes talking to some of these low propensity women who may decide to vote on abortion, inoculating on his position. So it wasn't just what he did out on the stump. They put dollars behind it. And we didn't
the
see
mail
it.
advantage.
People don't talk. I mean, we saw it, but
I've heard this. Did they do a ton more direct mail than you guys did?
significantly.
Yes.
That's what I've heard.
Well, but Brennan, it raises an interesting question about whether the abortion issue cut more in House and Senate races than it did in the presidential race. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our guys have been pretty out there on some of this for, I don't know, years and years and years. And it kind of finally caught up to bite them. They've taken votes on these things in ways that Donald Trump has never taken votes on them. You'll have people tell you that it matters less in places where abortion is not necessarily at risk, in blue states. But I don't know that that's. I think if you're still in New York and you're, have a voting record of voting against abortion rights, that's going to sting. And
Historically, money has been a real huge issue in presidential campaigns and especially lower level campaigns. But in this election, it didn't seem to be that much of an issue because the Trump campaign was outspent. What's happened here? Has this been a big change?
Trump has been outspent in all of his campaigns.
Yes.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
John Kerry outspent George W. Bush.
Yeah, but here, we're talking about
No, I
Substantial
think
numbers, yeah.
I think the higher the race, right, the more,
The inverse.
right,
Yeah.
it is, right? Money matters more in a House race than it does in a presidential.
Right.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And we saw that down ballot where Democrats significantly outraised Republicans and outperformed in a lot of races Republicans thought we were going to win. We didn't because Democrats outraised. And then at the top of the ticket, I don't know how much money you can spend to try to redefine Donald Trump in a way that he isn't already defined. So
The earned media value of
Yeah.
going to McDonald's and doing a shift there was, just absolutely incredible. We're talking hundreds of millions of
And
dollars.
it breaks through. It's not just
Right.
political people consuming
Yeah.
it. It's normies, right?
And then that's the clip. And that doesn't include the clips on TikTok and Instagram and everything else.
But you also didn't have to spend as much because you were outsourcing so much of the ground game, right, to other groups. And that's what a lot of the Harris campaign money went to. Although, obviously, as you guys have come under scrutiny for, it went to a lot of other things as well. But the ground game was a significant part of that, right?
That's exactly right. And in light of a new FEC decision that allows campaigns to coordinate ground efforts only with outside groups. We took full advantage of that.
Look, I'll admit, I was a skeptic because John Kerry tried that strategy and it blew up in his face.
Yep.
Ron
And I think a lot
DeSantis
of
also tried that
right, and it
strategy.
blew up and Ron. It's interesting. This is the first time it worked, but it sounds like the ability to coordinate better makes the strategy more of a realistic strategy now.
That's right. Divide and conquer. I mean, obviously, again, you only have a certain number of amount of dollars and a certain segment of the voters. Again, we were primarily going after low propensity voters, and so being able to contact them and use outside groups to do so when they had, obviously much easier ability to raise money was just a better use of our limited resources.
But the elephant in this room is Elon Musk. So what difference did it make that he shows up and opens up the bank vault?
I mean, I think the results bear out exactly.
But I mean, what did that allow you to do that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
Well, I mean, I think it was a value add, tremendously helpful in states like Pennsylvania, where essentially he lived for the last 45 days of the election. I think also it helped appeal to, again, that sense that we've got energy behind us, we've got non-traditional major supporters like Elon, like Joe Rogan, and others, and certainly he put his personal fortune on the line. I don't have exact numbers from them in terms of vote counts but I mean they knocked on an incredible amount of doors that we would not have otherwise reached. Now, we also had our own internal field program called Trump Force 47 that we branded and that we used to great effect. But, a lot of what the outside efforts were doing were additive, right? The repeated engagements, again, with those low propensity voters.
The Ron DeSantis ground game turned out to be really effective. It just that it didn't happen until it was for a candidate besides Ron DeSantis. That's a bit of an inside joke. The folks that did the Elon Musk ground game with all of his money were two of the folks who were very involved in the DeSantis campaign, such as it was, and they put a lot of stock into their ground game, which didn't cut much ice for DeSantis, but obviously helped the cause for Donald Trump.
That's right.
Ron DeSantis did come in second in Iowa when the polls had him coming in third, so may have helped a little
Small
bit.
things.
2 points.
Yeah, there
2
you go.
points
Small.
between.
But isn't one of the
Like a
downsides,
17,
though,
19, yeah.
of doing that, not that you guys need to worry about that again, because Donald Trump isn't going to run for president again, though, but
we don't
those
think.
groups own those data. Well, he said that. His word
is
but
always
unless
gold,
Congress
so,
does
yeah.
something. But isn't one of the downsides of that, the major downside, that those groups then own all of that data? You still, it sound like, have no insight into the people they actually ended up contacting. It's not then as if when you're heading into the midterms or someone else wants to run in 2028, it's not as if J.D. Vance, for instance, has ownership of that data in a way that the Republican Party can put it to work in the same exact way that Democrats send all of that data back to a central place.
Well, and I know the Democrats have this. I don't know what their equivalent is, but they have what's essentially a data trust, a nonprofit that will house that data. And so we are, again, in light of that FEC decision, we are able to take a lot of those targets, a lot of that data, and then house it at a nonprofit entity.
Can we now say there are no federal election laws, campaign money anymore? I mean, I'm sorry, it just isn't. Like, it is, you can now raise $1 million per person for a campaign. It used to be there was a max amount of money that they could give to collective federal races, right? I mean, it's the Wild West, no? Aren't we a pre-Watergate type of financing these days? Pretty close?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Without the suitcases, we got the money, but not the suit.
Well, they're not suitcases anymore, they're crypto.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not.
It's much lighter.
Chuck, the only people who aren't allowed to raise that kind of money are the two political parties,
Yeah,
okay?
exactly. Which
Yeah,
is, that's.
okay? So,
Look, Mitch McConnell was
problem.
right. McCain-Feingold was a disaster for the two political parties.
Yeah.
Going back to Brandon's point about the money, I do think that there's evidence it may have been decisive down ballot. There was a statistic that came out yesterday that of the 60-odd House races that were decided by 5 points or less, Democrats won 43 of them.
Wow.
And that's how they almost won
That's
the
a
House.
fun counterfactual for Brendan Buck. If Kevin McCarthy had not been ousted, and Kevin's fundraising prowess and all of his connections, which were obviously more significant than Mike Johnson's, would Kevin McCarthy have kept the bigger House majority?
Well, you joke, but like,
Kevin.
there is
You're
also a
Kevin's.
potential like long-term maybe downside with this new working class
Yeah.
coalition for Republicans is like we're just kind of getting outraised because our voters have fewer resources to devote to it. And Democrats have a very good culture of, so, if, your average Republican, your average Democrat sees something on MSNBC and gets fired up, they may go to Act Blue and make a contribution. The average Republican is going to see something on Fox and get upset, and they're just going to post on Facebook. And that has value too, but not in the same way.
But we said the governing, you innovate, so this feels like your moment for you guys to capitalize on Fox News hits or whatever we do.
Well, it's a matter of, to just do the demographics have the same resources that you need.
Well, but let's pick up there, Brendan. I'll start with you, but others should join in and talk about what the meaning of the outcome of the race for control of the House in the Senate is. I mean, it was a sweep for Republicans, but barely. 5 House seat majority, which is nothing. Control of the Senate, but mostly because you now have seats in Ohio and West Virginia and Montana that you probably should have had all along anyway. What does that tell us about where the country is? What does it tell us about how Washington's going to work?
I don't know that it tells us a whole lot. Like I said, we won the House aggregate vote by 3%, and we have 220 seats. In 2016, we won the House aggregate vote by 1% and had like 240 something. So it really just comes down to districts, and redistricting has not been very favorable to Republicans of late, and it was very favorable for a long time. What does it mean for governing? It's not only do we not have 220 seats, we're going to have 217 seats for much of the very beginning. It's going to be...
What happens when somebody falls off a roof while cleaning their gutters?
There are going to be days necessarily that there are more Democrats there than there are Republicans. Attendance is just an issue that you always have to monitor. That said, I think they're going to be relatively productive because they have to be. We now live in this world where every president gets elected, and basically every president since Clinton has had unified government in the start, and they live like they're dying. They spend those 2 years doing everything they possibly can because they know they're about to lose in the midterms. And if you're Republicans with a 5-seat majority, you get pretty sure you're going to lose in the midterms. So you do everything you possibly can right now. They are setting up a procedure with I don't get into reconciliation, but using a budget procedure where they can at least get 2 bites of an apple at passing things without the Senate filibuster. And they're probably going to get their tax bill done. They're probably going to get something on immigration and energy done. And the narrow margin is going to matter less than it did the last couple of years when they had a narrow margin, because Donald Trump is not going to allow them to fail. In 2017, we tried to do health care in the beginning, and we fell flat on our face. And you had a bunch of Republicans, even like really conservative ones, who voted against it, and Donald Trump was sort of unable to bring them along. That's not going to happen this time. And we ended up getting tax reform done because we had to, out of pure political necessity. Like if we had failed on that after failing on health care, we just couldn't allow it. So they're going to figure out a way to do it because they have to, but they also could get it done because they know this is their only window to do things. I've made that sound a little simpler than it is. It's going to be complicated with a narrow majority there, but I do think they're going to operate a lot more efficiently than they did in the past. But there are going to be a lot of moments also of bipartisanship that's going to be necessitated by the fact that Republicans won't vote for a lot of things that you can't do out of reconciliation. They're going to have to fund the government in March. There's no way Republicans can fund the government on their own. They don't like to vote for that. So Democrats are going to have to come in and bail them out, and what kind of negotiation that looks like. They're going to have to do the debt limit again this summer. Republicans can't vote to increase the debt limit on their own. So there's going to be opportunities for Democrats to come along, and I'll be very curious to see what Mike Johnson's standing in the conference is when one of the very first things he does is turn to Hakeem Jeffries and say, I need you to bail me out on this next vote.
Isn't this going to be a mirror image of the first 2 years of Biden? This narrow Senate, it was a narrow Senate majority where essentially it's just going to be this win big giant bill. I take your point that Trump will have a lot of influence, but there will be somebody who gets the Joe Manchin disease and says, "Ooh, look at me, I can have leverage." Members of Congress love to be when they get to know they get to have leverage. But is it it's really almost like a mirror image of the first 2 years of Biden, no?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know that they'll really care too much whether what they're doing is popular. I think that they, and I guess I would argue that is part of the reason why we're all, everything that we're talking about today was the agenda was not as popular as Democrats had hoped it would be. But they probably, again, will be much more motivated by putting big points on the board. I don't know that they've really defined what the other big package is, and that's the other thing. So I come
We're going to pass something.
I come from the John Boehner, Paul Ryan era where we were putting out our agendas and kind of like outlined before the election, here's what we're going to do if we win, and they haven't done that. And so there's this like vague, we're going to do a big reconciliation package on energy and immigration, but I don't really know what else, and I don't really know what that means either.
I think they have concepts of a
Exactly.
Nice.
Concepts of a plan.
But wait, you said they're going to get something done on immigration. What?
Funding for
yeah.
immigration. So the enforcement measures that Donald Trump has in mind, you can't, do without resources to do them.
So you're not talking about an overhaul reform?
No, there's no chance that they,
Yeah.
and so I don't mean to get too in the weeds on this, but the tool they're going to use, reconciliation, that allows you to get outside of the Senate filibuster, can only really be used with fiscal measures. You can't do policy changes. And so they'll find some way to make funding for immigration enforcement, whether that's more money for judges or more money for detention centers or whatever, more money for border agents. They'll find some way to make that fit within reconciliation where they can do the enforcement piece. He can't do like remain in Mexico or any kind of policy like that on immigration. This is just about getting the resources they need. Because to my point, if you just try to do this through your normal funding process, where Republicans will never be able to vote to fund the full government, it'll get blocked in the Senate, and they would have to do it in a bipartisan way. And of course, Democrats aren't going to give money for that.
I don't want to get too wonky here, and I want Alex to, because you did congressional relations in the Trump White House for 4 years. But is Donald Trump going to do tariffs by executive order or by legislation?
Oh, man. I want to take tariffs, though, after you.
I assume he's going to do it by executive order. I mean, that's the authority that he has.
But you can't score the revenue as...
You make a very good point. So one of the other things that they're wrestling with is doing taxes is really expensive. And is there a way to capture that revenue and score it? So another thing of reconciliation is you have to set sort of fiscal targets that you have to stay within. If you want to do full extension of the tax laws that are expiring, it's like $4 or $5 trillion. And you have to pass a budget that says you're going to do that. That's not an easy vote. I'm going to pass a budget that's going to add $4 or $5 trillion to the deficit. So they are going to be looking for ways to reduce that number. One way that is being floated is, can you try to get the Congressional Budget Office to score the revenue that Donald Trump would be bringing in by doing tariffs? Currently, you don't get credit for that. You don't get budget credit for something the president just sort of does because it's not in the bill. Now, they could direct the Congressional Budget Office to do whatever they want. Or they can just simply ignore it and say, he did this over here. We're gonna count this. Don't worry about it. It's not really $4 trillion. There's lots of ways they can go about this. I don't think Republicans want to vote to put in statute tariffs, but I do think Donald Trump is very serious about using them. I do think that he actually very firmly believes that China will pay the bill instead of American consumers.
What steps does the Democratic Party need to consider to get back on track in 26 and 28? Or is it really more of a matter that in today's contemporary politics, there's nothing wrong with the Democratic Party that the Republican Party can't fix?
Well, there is a truth to the latter part, I think. I do think that we are in a period of change elections that is for reasons bigger than one party's brand or the other, but rather a disconnect between people and institutions and the people who represent them. And so I think that to fix the problem, Democrats and institutions broadly need to work on regaining public trust. And so I do think that that's important. I think that structurally, the move of working class voters and, you know, the sort of class divide we see emerge is going, if it continues, will create an unfixable structural disadvantage for Democrats. And so that has to stop, that has to be fixed. And so I think that there are lots of things you can look at. Right now, we're in an inflationary environment and it's very cost-driven, but I think there are other culture conversations that we are on the losing end of. There's a, you know, broader brand perceptions that we as a party tell people how to talk, how to think, that I don't think were driving factors in how people voted in this election, but can be quite pernicious and create bigger distance. If the premise of ever getting elected is that you can convince someone that you understand their life, you respect them and the work and the challenge, you know, that they are going through in their lives, you can't do that when you're perceived as someone who talks down and preaches to them. And so I think those can be pernicious problems even if they're not vote driving. At the same time, I do think that the party's brands are similarly deeply flawed and problematic, and we are likely to swing back and forth. And I also think that doesn't just exist in government and in politics. It is media, it is corporations, it is, you know, it is across the board. You know, the numbers on institutions over the last 20 to 30 years have just fallen off a cliff. And so some of these are byproducts of a larger dissatisfaction that I think we can, you know, say it is unique to one party because one party lost an election, or we could widen the aperture and see that that is just a symptom of a much bigger problem.
Alex, man, I thought you were going to talk about Congress and tariffs. That's why I held back. But when it comes to the Democratic Party and what the party needs to do, just based on, you know, my conversations with voters and what I saw from the Harris campaign, you know, because there wasn't the Democratic primary, Democrats didn't go into the battleground states or any of the other states early on and really have the conversations in that way. And certainly President Biden, you know, campaigned for re-election. That's not what I mean, but it wasn't the same exact conversation that was taking place among Republicans where people were, you know, were really engaged because there wasn't the primary. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But the thing that I consistently heard from voters was that they were frustrated with the idea that they felt, particularly in communities of color, the idea that Democrats only came around when it was an election year and it was time for their vote, and that there wasn't this consistent years-long conversation in their communities about how they were feeling, what they wanted to change. And I heard this in barber shops. I heard this at churches. I heard this from voters from all walks of life. And so it seems to me, coming out of this election, that as Democrats rebuild, that there is, even within the Democratic Party, conversations that are going to have to take place as they rebuild.
I do want to give credit to Democrats for at least, it seems at this point, like taking seriously and trying to like look inward and see if they need to. My party has not done a very good job of like learning lessons or even trying to. You know, we put together in, I guess it was 2012, like the sort of blueprint for coming back and completely ignored every part of it. I don't know
No, Trump's finally figured out how to win Hispanic voters.
I know. It was, yeah, that's true. And so I don't know how long Democrats will be engaged in this process, but like, you know, some recognition that sort of identity groups in DC shouldn't be calling all of your shots, and like realizing that like being the language police turns off a lot of voters, I think is useful. We'll see if it sticks, but I do want to commend them for at least like having that conversation.
Can I just make a
I would
notation?
help with that comment.
So, if you look at the last three Democratic nominees for president, they were all sort of anointed. Meaning, you know, it didn't feel like they came from the voters. I'm not saying that Biden didn't participate in the primaries, and neither did Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton had the heavy hand of Barack Obama helping her get that nomination. Jim Clyburn stopped the clock, if you will. I don't think it's a given that Biden wins that nomination.
Well, COVID stops the campaign.
Right, COVID, there's no doubt, COVID and Clyburn, two C's there. And of course, Harris was sort of anointed into this. I think I wouldn't underestimate that when there's truly this open sort of process, that you were going to see new voices. I mean, look, it's not lost on me that two of the most interesting Democratic victors are, or actually one was a loser and one was a winner, both were auto mechanics. Dan Osborne in Nebraska, don't call him a Democrat, Dan Osborne, and Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, who has held and held a seat in Washington State that's been a Republican seat. But look, Republicans have had the wrong type of Republican nominated each time that she's won. So
Joe Kent.
But the way they have figured out how to talk with voters rather than talk to voters, I think my point is, I think you're going to see that the party needs 1,000 flowers to bloom here for a cycle or two, to sort of get. They just need, it's sort of, they need to plant new seeds and they need new crops to grow. Those crops are candidate.
This is slightly trollish, but to Brendan's argument, I would say that it sounds appealing, this idea of introspection and change, but it does seem like the lesson of both 2020 and 2024 is that the party that wins the election is the party that's in denial about having lost the last one.
Touché.
Anita, I'd be particularly interested in what you think about this, but others as well. I think about a parallel moment in 1980. Reagan wins, much bigger victory than was expected, takes the Senate, Republicans pick up huge ground in the House, and there's this moment of shock and then reappraisal. And in that case, a lot of it was ideological. Did we fail because we didn't go far enough left in the Ted Kennedy direction, or should we go to the center? And it took 12 years for Democrats to figure out the answer to that question was go to the center with Bill Clinton. Is this about ideology again, and is that same kind of conversation inevitably now going to happen?
So, Jerry, I think that it is less about ideology right now, and I think it is far more about, the party kind of finding a way to not see people as members of groups, but to actually see them as part of a broader public. And Brendan mentioned this. If you look at Donald Trump's race, he actually did not spend a lot of time referring to people as in terms of the groups they were in. He does a little of that. But I think that it's more a way of approaching the electorate. So it's a little what Chuck was talking about is, people who can talk with voters. But it's also, I think, an orientation that is very much around not seeing politics as much as a transaction. Here's the tax break I'm giving you, here's the thing I'm giving you, and starting to actually build a community around shared values again, which is, I think, part of what we're losing right now. The other thing that I think is interesting coming out of this discussion, though, if you listen carefully, is that we need to start thinking about voters in a much broader sense, as opposed to the voters who voted for us last time or that we think have a propensity. I'm struck by how much Alex has spoken about low propensity voters. I'm struck very much, as we've seen now for 3 elections, how Donald Trump brings people to vote that none of us are tracking, none of us have been in contact with, right? And so I think that one of the challenges for the Democratic Party is going to be, how do you broaden this conversation out? How do you go engage with people in places we're not doing that well with right anymore? And I think that as we look at this, it is less kind of Bill Clinton versus, the left, whatever. I think it is far more a kind of broader orientation, and it is generational. It is just generational here, so.
I want to highlight something Jonah Goldberg wrote about Kamala Harris, and it triggered something. He said, sometimes she sounded too much like a college president. And Donald Trump says nonsense, and it's perfectly understandable. And I mean that.
Yeah.
No, I'm not trying to mock it. Like, the way, in some ways, he may speak, but you get what he's saying. And if you actually look at our losing presidential candidates of the last 30 years, the one who sounds more like the college president loses. Mitt Romney, John Kerry, Al Gore, Hillary Clinton, right? And, what did Bill Clinton, I do think language here matters a little bit. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Joe Biden too, they knew how to speak American, I call it. And, Obama would get mocked for dropping his G's. That was smart to drop your G's when you're starting to talk about, Bill Clinton was Bubba, right? So there is something about it, and Donald Trump, speaks a common language to the people he's talking to. And the more mocking us college president types do of it, in some ways, it only reinforces it. So, I don't want to say it's all language or all, but there's something to this, which is why it only the perception of the party only got more negatively reinforced when they anointed candidates, right? It all felt like it was the elites making this decision for you, right? And it just, a voter isn't going to tell you that's why they couldn't connect, but I think you can see that that's why they didn't connect.
I think a problem for Democrats, though, is that that's their coalition. And it's it's hard to be the anti-institutional party when you are when you're the party of the people who trust institutions. And, it's just not going to be believable on some level.
Well,
Yeah,
that's why the pardon is so bad. Sorry. It totally blows up the institutional argument.
Well, I mean, setting that aside, I do think.
Sorry, I know. I know, a little too close. Sorry. About the pardon.
I have thought about this, Molly, so much in the election and in the aftermath of the election. How are you the party of building up rather than tearing down? And I mean that in institutional sense. Donald Trump is a tear it down candidate. And not everyone in his party is. And I think that's why he outperforms his party. But he is tear it down. Democrats tend to be build it up, and the government can fix it, and programs will fix it, and all of that. And how do you not create cynicism, or how do you not sort of just try to match where Republicans go on that to win elections? And I actually think it's doable. There are lots of institutions that Democrats believe are broken and flawed and in need of fixing. And I think that in some ways, Barack Obama was great at challenging the norms and the way things were going and the way people felt in the country without then saying, let's rip apart all of our norms. I think that there's sort of a difference between calling out and relating to cynicism to make a change of what is broken and just sort of matching Trump with like, let's tear it all down. And I think you need the right candidate to do it. And I think that the difference between Obama and Trump is very small in that fundamental regard, which was he came out and said, this is bad, we are frustrated. He was more a believer in we can fix it. Donald Trump is, this is bad, this is broken, and I mean, I can fix it. I mean, it's a very different sort of solution-oriented piece, but I think that there are ways Democrats can do it because we do have a lot of problems with institutional flaws, and Republicans are believers in certain institutions and not others, but you do just have to have the candidate who wears that jacket. I mean, Donald Trump has lots of imitators and they fall completely down on their face. Barack Obama, lots of imitators. They can't capture that. And so I think it just, as much as we want to sort of diagnose, and I think part of the reason the introspection is difficult is the people who are out there executing the message. We don't just print Coca-Cola labels on everything and then it's the same thing in every can. Like, these are different people and they're going to fit and work with different, others. So as much as we can write a memo that says appeal to Latino voters, Donald Trump does the exact opposite and it appeals to Latino voters, but if anybody else were to try that, it wouldn't work. And so I think therein lies the challenge of the academic exercise of how do we rebrand. I think we have to take the lessons, and then you do have to have the right candidates, and they have to meet that moment. And I think that's just fundamentally at the root of all of this.
And so much of this is fixable with the right candidate at the right moment,
Yes.
right? I mean, look, Democrats for a half century have won the White House when they have an outsider candidate who's running to clean up a Republican mess. The only exception is Joe Biden. I would argue a fairly anomalous year because of COVID, and he won narrowly. Obviously, Joe Biden was not an outsider, but Carter, Clinton, and Obama all have the same profile, running in really down times for the Republican Party, and they're outsiders vowing to clean up the Republican mess. And I think that's the scenario for 2028 is just you find somebody that's new. Keep in mind, by the way, 2028 will be the first time in 44 years that you did not have a Clinton or a Biden running or looming over the campaign. So this is a clean break for the party, and they're going to find somebody new that's not Clinton or Biden. And even in 2000 and 2004, the Clintons were still effectively in charge of the Democratic Party. So those are two families going back for a long time, and I think that that's the best comeback strategy. The best strategy for reform is always the other guy screw up. always the other guy screw up.
Well, you just said overreach, which leads to the last question I wanted to ask, which is, what does Donald Trump, what do the Republicans have a mandate to do, and what is beyond the mandate that they just got in a very weird and close election?
Well, I think the mandate on the border actually is, I mean, in that sense, if they don't make significant progress, that's a huge fault line. I mean, I would argue that's almost like, it's almost the equivalent of when Barack Obama said, I'm going to sign a healthcare law by the end of my first term, right? It is so declarative on the border. So whatever this looks like to the public, meaning they've got to think that's significant. Everything else, I think, is much lower down the chain, and I think the question is overreach. I mean, I think the biggest red flag they have is this relationship they have with the wealthiest crypto people. Like, if you want to ask me what's going to be the Achilles heel of this administration, it's the obsession over making crypto happen. And I just think it's a potential financial disaster. And if that is as bad as some people fear that it could be, but just the idea that this whole thing is about creating wealth for a bunch of people who already have wealth, I just think it's a hugely, that if you were to say, what could hand the working class vote right back to the left? It's the small group of folks who have helped Trump, who are obsessed with sort of making crypto seem like a legitimate currency and financial investment.
If you subscribe to Chuck's view that he expressed earlier about we just vote against, we don't vote for, then he doesn't have a mandate. No president really recently has a mandate. I do agree that immigration, fixing the border would be popular, and that would be good for him. But I think he needs to be very careful about how he executes this deportation program. Like, that could go sideways really fast if it's much more aggressive than the public can tolerate. So this is why we kick people out every midterm because they don't actually have mandates. They just start doing stuff. And that's just how it has been for a long time, and I expect that's how it will go this time.
Can I ask a fast question of Anita? Because you've seen a few of these campaigns. Do you think that the Dem nominee in 2028 is somebody that is on the list that we could all recite in our sleep, or is it somebody else we're not talking about?
You know, I don't know. I'm just going to be honest. I don't know. But I think that there are people that we're not talking about who potentially could run and be very credible, because I think that if you think through everything that's been discussed on this panel, voters are going to be looking for someone, and this is voters, not necessarily insiders, right?
Wise guys.
Right? But they're going to be looking for somebody who's very authentic, who they feel engages with them in a very real way, who understands their life experiences, who's on their side, who's a fighter, who's tough. And they're going to be looking for someone who does not sound like a normal politician, you know? And right now we have a bunch of very skilled politicians who are running. And then we have some people who sound a little different, who are thinking about running. So I think it'll be quite interesting to see how it plays out. But I am, often at the end of the day, the institutional person can bring so much weight to the process that they win. I mean, we saw that in 2004. We've seen this over and over again. And then sometimes that doesn't happen, as was the case in 2008. So, so I think that it is way early, as always, Jonathan, to be handicapping this. But I think that there are people that are not on the list right now who will end up being interesting candidates.
I would really like to hear Alex on this question of the view from Trump world about what the mandate is for.
Yes.
And but first I can't resist just a little story. After Trump won in 2016, he immediately started going out and doing rallies again, which was really weird. And so I went to, I think the first one was was asking people this question, like, what do you think Trump has to do to earn your continued support? And this one guy said, well, he did say he was going to build the wall and make Mexico pay for it, so he definitely has to do that. But then, of course, if he can't get it done for some reason, I would understand. And that certainly proved true. But so what do you think the mandate is for?
Yeah, well, first, there's no denying that President Trump learned a lot in his first term. There's just no way you can't not learn, right? But in doing so, I mean, he does understand where the levers are. I think he said very clearly on day one that he wants to secure the border, whether that's done by executive order, whether that's done by legislation. I think a combination, all of the above. And obviously, again, the economy, inflation. So taking measures to try to lower inflation, whether that's through permitting reform, making sure that we're increasing energy production, domestic energy production. He just yesterday said that he wants to reshore manufacturing to the United States. So again, that means permitting reform through the EPA. He's been very clear that particularly when it comes to the economy and the flip side of that, inflation, but again, securing the border, that's a day one priority.
Okay, we're going to go to questions from our audience in just a moment, but I do have one final question I'd love to get everybody's thoughts on. The narrative on the president-elect coming into this election was that he won the 2016 election against a flawed candidate, that in 20 he became the first president since Hoover to lose the White House, the Senate, and the House, and then his candidates failed very poorly in 2022. Against that backdrop and that narrative, how significant is his comeback? Historically significant.
It's only happened one other time,
I was
right?
going to say,
Grover
Grover Cleveland would
Yeah.
have an answer for that, I guess.
But my whole point is I actually think the era matters a lot. I've been obsessed with this period, both periods of the pre-Civil War period. We had 7 presidencies in 28 years between Jackson and Lincoln. And then between Grant and McKinley, we had 5 one-term presidencies, including the 2 Grover Cleveland presidencies. So in some ways, I think it's more emblematic. Yes, it's his comeback, but it's more emblematic of just sort of the going back to this electorate. This is we are in a change. I mean, we've had 2012 and 2004 are the only 2 elections this century where nothing flipped, the House, the Senate, or the White House. I mean, it is the norm. You go back to the first, last 30 years of the last 50 years, basically post World War II to 9/11, and we didn't have any of that kind of constant change. So 40 years of one party controlling the House. So I just think we're in yes, his comeback is historic, but I think 50 years from now, the era's more historic than the individuals. Just like I think we forget how this works. At the time, I think Grover Cleveland was thought of as a bigger deal in the moment. Now the era is a bigger deal. I think over time, this uncertainty of the 21st century, and I have this whole larger theory that this Trump realignment actually began right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you think about it, Trump 1.0 was Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. And in many ways, that was actually the early warning signs of what was coming.
And Sarah Palin.
And what was coming back in '92. So I just think this era is going to end up mattering more. I think the comeback absolutely deserves kudos and all of those things. I just think what will matter more is the era we're living in 50 years from now.
I think Trump deserves a huge amount of credit for having the imagination to believe that this was possible. Because it is, I don't believe in history. I was an English major. But it's very easy to look at history, which is a small sample size when it comes to presidential elections, and say, well, this can't be done because it's never been done before, or it's only happened this one time. And Trump didn't take that for an answer. He said, no, I believe that it's possible because I believe that I can do it. So I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for having come back against tremendous odds.
Mostly, I think, as it relates to winning the primary. What's remarkable about him is the absolute stranglehold he has, and that's been said many, many times. I do think that, with all of the things we've talked about, how unhappy people were and inflation, that, and Nikki Haley probably could have won this election, who knows. But what's remarkable about him is the loyalty that he has amongst such a massive number of people. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that. And that is really what has endured here in a way that allowed this to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, some questions from the audience. Question number one from Will, who was a student who worked with me here. Do Democrats have a message clarity problem? Since Obama 08, Hope and Change, it's hard to recall a clear message from a Democratic campaign. They often seem to get caught up in their own language. Trump's basic language seems to come across more clearly with the Republic. Is this exacerbated by two media-averse candidates? Molly, I'll make you start.
Okay. A lot to unpack on that.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think we point to the heads of party here rather than individual candidates. And again, I will go back to, I think we have candidates in our party, either Senate, governors, members of Congress, who are great and clear communicators. Trump is an excellent communicator of what he means. Do you know, like, he may not use the words, as Chuck said, but he is very good at communicating what he means, and people get that. And I think Barack Obama, in very different ways, was very good. And I think sometimes we shorthand a slogan for voters understanding what the candidates' values are and what they mean and what they're going to do. And I think we're looking at two candidates. You know, I think that's, I think that is an oversimplification of the party writ large. And so I think we do, though, have a communication challenge. And I think that communication challenge is answering voters' concerns with policies, as Anita mentioned. I think saying, I will fix it, instead of I hear you, is a very different thing for voters. They want to be heard. They want you to understand. And I think we don't have a message problem as much as we have an ability to sort of meet people on an emotional level. But then I don't think we have media-averse candidates. I know that's been a lot of the discourse after this campaign. I do think that Republicans this cycle and in general have done a better job of capitalizing on a fractured media environment and having a presence in places where political conversations are not happening. And they talk and engage with voters about culture issues and going to MMA fights where there's no political discourse, but it is I see your culture, I relate to your culture, I appreciate your culture. And I think you can say the same for just this online discourse. And I don't think Democrats really are competitive there. And I think we have a much smaller echo chamber of people just agreeing with each other all the time, but we are not talking to people who have no interest in a political conversation, because I don't think it is a one-liner message that tells voters what you stand for. As much as Hope and Change is, pithy and it works, it was that voters understood what that meant. They felt it because we were having a better conversation with them. And so I sort of reject some of the premise of the question in sloganing or like succinct message for a party writ large, but I completely acknowledge and agree that we have a communication challenge about how we see voters and how we relate to them, and honestly, where we relate to them, because we're just not talking to them where they are.
But this goes back to the authenticity argument, I think, although I will add that when we fight, we win, maybe didn't really get the people going. Maybe not as much, by the way, as we're not going back, which wasn't an official slogan at all. It was when we fight, we win, and they changed it to when we vote, we win. But I think this goes back to the authenticity argument, because when you tune into a Donald Trump rally, it's like anything can happen, right? You, as a reporter, you have to be watching it. Like, you can't skip a Donald Trump rally and then just think, okay, maybe I'll catch up to it later because anything can happen. Whereas with the traditional stump speech for a politician, you can skip a rally here or there, an event here and there, and it's it's probably going to be the same thing. So you're probably fine. Whereas when we talk about Trump, right, it was just something new and something different all the time. It really did connect with people. I covered Trump's first presidency, and there were times where, you'd be talking to people in the audience and you would hear him on stage. And I mean, it's not as if he's out there talking to people in the audience, but he really had the pulse, though, of how people were feeling about things. And he managed to really tap into that. And when it comes to connecting with people, I mean, there's multiple ways that you can do it. That's how he did it. Of course, retail politics is another way that other candidates do that, by having the one-on-one conversations with people rather than the big rallies. So I don't think there's any one way that you have to do that as a candidate, although certainly the way that Trump has done it with the rallies is one of those ways.
Okay, I have another question from our audience from Mr. C. Malcolm Elbentz. If you look at moderates of both parties, do you think that moving toward Trump was a vote against ideology that they felt was critical of their values? What roles do elites have in alienating moderates and rural voters?
It's a pretty loaded question.
Yeah.
I guess it all depends on what your definition of who the elites are. I will say this, and I'm going to say something that it's a little offbeat here, but I think the problem that losing politicians have is the same problem we in the media industry have, is we're not local enough. And I think, and it's sort of obviously we have a local news problem, but it gets at the fact that we cover politics too much from a national lens, constantly. And so I just don't think we have enough reporting from rural America by rural reporters. So I think that's what creates the perception that's been exploited by those that want to create this narrative about so-called elites, who, whatever the definition of that is, right? One person's elite is another person's ally, and it's sort of like it's always funny, like somebody asked me, like, do the Democrats have too many celebrities endorsing them? And I'm like, well, what's Hulk Hogan and Joe Rogan, right? It's just, each party has different types of celebrities. Each party has different types of elites. Right. I think it's fair to say the current sort of legacy elites are the ones that I think have the disconnect issue right now. And we in so-called legacy media and mainstream media sort of in many ways embody that. But part of that is because we've lost all of our local allies.
Rural voters these days are not moderate. They are pretty conservative. And that's been a very long-term phenomenon in terms of the movement to the right. And a lot of moderates have moved into the Democratic Party, self-described ideological moderates. The Democrats, in terms of how their voting coalition describes themselves, is far more composed of people who call themselves moderates, whereas the Republican Party is dominated by self-described conservatives, which are a much larger portion of the electorate than liberals are. But I really think that the realignment we are talking about is not only a demographic realignment, it is an ideological realignment. And the populist platform that Trump has used to take over and re-engineer the ideology of the Republican Party needs to be taken more seriously. And I think candidates who will be successful in the future will innovate ideologically in the way that they present what they believe in and their platform to voters.
Just a quick addition. The question referred to values, and I wonder if that's a reference to transgender, anti-transgender ads that got so much attention, and how big a factor was that? I mean, that may be part of what the questioner is getting at. Did it matter? Did people vote on cultural?
I think it's less about values and more about priorities. What do the voters prioritize?
Yeah.
I don't think I would love to hear what Molly has to say. I don't think that the transgender ads, if they were effective, were because people like prioritize transgender issues. I think it spoke to like a window into sort of the priorities, like what is your ideology, what is your mindset. It just sort of confirmed the sort of worst fears about liberals and their priorities and all of the different identity groups that they're tending to instead of you. And that was ultimately, I think, what it was about.
Isn't it a 1% issue? And that's the problem, right? The trans population is 1%. And I think what Democrats may have missed on the attack, it was not about attacking trans people. It was about going to your priorities point, which is they're obsessed over a 1% problem I'm part of the 99% problem.
Yeah, well, but they're not obsessed, and this is what drives Democrats crazy, understandably, is like, we spend so much time developing a housing plan, and like, we don't think about the tree and stuff for 10 seconds, and we get tagged as being obsessed with it, right? And it's deeply frustrating, and I think understandably for them, but life's not fair, and you got to accept that, and you got to fight back against it, and you got to inoculate yourself because of it. She was a black woman from California, the Bay Area to be exact, who was, of course, was going to be attacked and perceived as a liberal. You've got to come to terms with that, and you've got to inoculate that and go above and beyond to prove that you're not the caricature. And I think she failed in not going far enough to rebut that claim, which was so predictable that's how Trump was going to
San Francisco liberal, right?
San Francisco
They've been doing it for 50
liberal.
years. By the way, it's not lost on me that the Democrats have lost the popular vote 3 times since 1988.
Boston.
Twice it's
Yeah,
Bostonians,
there you go.
right, that had the liberal reputation, and once it's a San Francisco
To
Democrat.
bring this back to
it's a branding issue.
To bring this
with
back
those
to
two.
bring this back to elites, how did this happen in the first place? There was, I guess, a questionnaire by the ACLU asking this totally ridiculous sort of edge case of if there were
And she
illegal
answered it.
immigrants in
Right.
prison, would you
'Cause
use
she did
taxpayer
the right
dollars?
Yeah, there was the video.
And
of it,
she
too.
said yes. And
The
so
video, yeah.
there's, you know, I'm sure you
Don't
guys,
answer questionnaires, right? Isn't that the real, right? Is that, never answer a questionnaire.
the fact that
policy
she
to
felt
have.
pressured
It's
from the
Apple factory.
groups
It's an
to say
Apple
yes to
Successful
that.
former 2-term governor of Kansas just agreed with that. by the way.
But
questionnaires.
somebody, and I know who it is in the Trump campaign, got a nice bonus for finding that clip, I think.
I have one final question I want to go to, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't come up with the idea to ask this earlier. It came from a member of our audience who's here with us today, who suggested it. Secretary Clinton was nominated and lost in 16. Vice President Harris was nominated and lost in 20. I agree with Brendan that had Nikki Haley won the Republican nomination, she probably would have been elected, but she couldn't win the Republican nomination. How bad are the double standards in the way that men and women candidates are treated? And is that something that's going to change, and at what point?
If I answer for Mrs. Todd, she has a different answer than I have, but I will just leave it at that. She believes it's not going to happen in our lifetime. And I know a lot of women of a certain age who now believe that. I will go to my grave believing that Hillary Smith beats Donald Trump. I will always believe her last name was a bigger problem than her first name.
Is it going to take a Thatcher, Anita? I mean, is the first female president going to have to be right of center to play against type?
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the unfortunate reality of, well, I agree that I think that Hillary Clinton had unique vulnerabilities, that gender played in. I have long said, I think sexism in the 90s against Hillary Clinton and in her ascent into the public consciousness that was very much loaded into what a first lady should be versus what she was, and that sexism played a role and chased her throughout her entire career, even as I do believe we have moved to be a better country on those things, but she bore the brunt of that. And so I think sexism played a role, but I also think she was not the right candidate for the moment. And as we've discussed, he's run the best campaign I think he's run, but Donald Trump is a unique, sort of generational candidate. So the fact that we've nominated 2 women and they both went up against a generational candidate, what we are now going to do is decide that a Democratic woman cannot win. Because instead of saying 2 women went up against a generational candidate with unique circumstances, inflation, all of these things, we will be afraid for a while, I imagine. Or at least the women candidates are going to, when they do get in, because women will run, they are going to contend with that as a looming question that male candidates will not. And so, yes, this idea that women can't win is going to plague them because we are going to ask it and is going to be forefront, and we will isolate that as a factor, even though we've spent 4 hours discussing all of the historic factors and all of the uniqueness and the strategy and all of those things that we think played the largest role in Trump winning, but we will then penalize the next women who run because women have lost, and we don't penalize when men win for those losses because men have won before.
So Molly, the one thing I would add to that is that there is learning to be had from those 2 campaigns, and yes, they both ran against, a generational talent of many different kinds. And someone who'd been on TV and someone who understands the showman piece of this better than anyone in their lifetime. But there was no reason that the Democratic Party wouldn't want to take the steps to say, the next time a woman wins this nomination, can we make sure that we know exactly what we need to do to
Completely.
put her, because I think kind of both are true,
I
to be honest.
completely agree
Yeah.
with you. Completely agree
Yeah.
with you. We should not ignore it. We should not assume these things, but I think we will overcorrect in the threshold test,
As we always do.
as we always do.
As
But
we always
instead of saying, let's not overcorrect, let's learn, I think is what we need.
We're here in Kansas, a great state,
With a
not
terrific
just in
governor.
basketball, but in other ways too. And this is a state that has elected succession of women to statewide office in both parties, one of which is joining us here in the front row today, Governor Sebelius. And so I don't think it's something about values. This is obviously states firmly in the center, of the country, sort of the heartland. And I'm also reminded, being here in the Dole Institute, as I look at the pictures of Bob Dole and his war wounds, I kind of wonder if the first female president, it may not necessarily be a Thatcher center right, but it's going to have to be somebody with national security credentials
Yeah,
that
maybe
can pass
better.
the commander-in-chief test. And there's two women running for governor next year in Jersey and Virginia, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia and Mikey Sherrill, and they happen to be roommates, and they happen to both have national security backgrounds, and they're both in their mid-40s with long careers to go. And I just wonder if that will be the crucial inoculation for the woman who does become president, having been in the line of fire or at least served in the CIA, something like that, that gives them that credential.
Okay, but the state of Virginia has never elected a woman
The
governor.
Commonwealth of
Right.
Virginia, thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
The Commonwealth of Virginia has never elected. Now, they're going to this time because it's going to be two women
Right.
nominees. But it is worth noting
Yes.
that Virginia never has.
Well,
and that's
The South has been behind on gender compared to the West, especially, but also the Midwest too, when it comes to statewide women. Yeah. So.
Okay. As Audrey mentioned in her introduction, we've been doing these post-election conferences for 20 years. I truly can't remember or imagine we would have had a better discussion and a better group of panelists than today. Let's thank them for a great discussion. We thank you all for coming out, and now that you know exactly what happened in the election last month, we invite you to come back to the Dole Institute in the future for other programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun. Yeah.